I wanted to welcome John Smith, the latest appointment. Nathan isn't here, but this is the first time in 5 years we've had 2 new permanent members on the commission. So, John, if you can just welcome and just a little bit of background of your experience and. Not the Encyclopedia Britannica, right. Because otherwise you've had a distinguished career.
Get used to this mic. Is this about right? Okay. As you said, my name is John Smith. I live in Vero Beach. Lived here for 12 years. Our home is on Silver Palm. For most people, if I tell you we're 1 block back from the ice cream store at Con Beach, everybody knows where we live. All right. I've been retired for many years. I retired as an accounting professor at the University of Northern Illinois. I spent 30 years teaching accounting and finance, and writing in accounting and finance. I've written 2 textbooks in accounting. Before that, I spent 3 years with Pricewaterhouse auditing. And while I've never practiced per se in government accounting, I have audited cities and school districts and somewhat familiar with the process. Other background that might help. I was saying to Cindy that I was with the SEC for a year and saw the regulatory accounting from that point of view. And in fact, it was the years that the Government Accounting Standard Board was formed, in addition to the FASB. I'm looking forward to this. Cindy gave me a stack of records about this thing, which I have been through. I haven't absorbed all of them yet, but I will as the process goes. But I'm happy to be here. Thanks.
Well, thank you. With that, the first order of business is a nomination for chairman.
I'll move Peter Gorey for chairman.
Support.
Okay. All in favor? Any other nomination?
Presumption.
All in favor?
Aye.
Thank you. I want to, Vice Chairman, I want to nominate again Glenn Bravant. Do I have a second?
No, you don't need a second. If you just ask for if there are any other nominations. If there aren't, then he automatically
Thank you.
Yes.
Are there any other nominations? So moved. Welcome, Glenn. We do have we do have a number of items. Some of them are essential because they're time constrained, and so Cindy has put them on the agenda. So we do have public comment, and as you know, in the Finance Commission, we have always welcomed comment at any time, not only where it's printed on the agenda. So with that,
we have the approval of minutes.
Do we have an approval of the minutes?
So moved.
All in favor? Aye. It passes unanimously. With that, if there's no public comment, seeing none, Cindy, if you would, I turn the proceedings over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
You're welcome.
As Peter mentioned, there are a number of things on here. They are kind of in my priority order only because a couple of them are time critical. So I'm going to hit the highlights on these things and leave the extent of the discussion to your discretion. The first one is one that has been before both the City Council and the Utility Commission, and the City Council requested that we bring it to you and the Utility Commission for your comments and recommendation. And that is a discussion regarding eliminating electric utility impact fees. We actually charge impact fees for new development in addition to other new account fees for turning on and providing the service, et cetera. We also straight up charge an impact fee. And you'll see from the attached sheet what those fees are currently for residential and commercial development. You know, when we looked at the detail of the draft rate study, our consultants at that time last year indicated to us that impact fees in an electric utility were, although allowable under Home Rule Authority, not really something that anyone else does. And as a matter of fact, right now, they've indicated we are the only people in the state of Florida as a municipal electric utility that charge impact fees. And so we had always intended, at the completion of the rate study, to recommend the elimination of them. That decision has been brought forward by the fact that we're starting to see a fair amount of new development, and in particular had a couple of development applications where the impact fees are extremely high and will be prohibitive for the developer. And so what we're asking is that we go ahead and bring this forward for consideration now and eliminate those fees immediately and then fold that into the final rate study. We're not actually talking about a substantial amount of money in total. We budgeted about $250,000 a year. We've collected on average about $159 for the last 5 years. Those fees are exclusively for capital projects, so they're part of our multi-million-dollar capital improvement fund, which, as a side note, is going to go down in size as we have eliminated the power plant and all the upgrades for the power plant that run about $2 million a year. So staff is definitely recommending that we eliminate these immediately. We have been holding them in abeyance since December the 16th. In other words, we have not collected them from anyone, but we have told people, depending on the final decision, you may still owe it to us, but starting with the 16th, we haven't actually collected anymore. And so with that, we're here to answer any questions you might have, and we would like your recommendation. The Utility Commission voted unanimously to support staff's recommendation to eliminate these fees.
Discussion? Questions?
Cindy, I take it it's a retroactive change in the expenditure by $250. Is that what we're going to on the budget?
It's a change in revenue by $250.
Right. Mm-hmm. So are we going to do that, or are we just going to ride it through?
It would be part of a budget amendment.
Okay, so it's going to be part of that.
But again, in the I think the adopted capital improvement program for this year is some in the neighborhood of $4 or $5 million. So it's not really a huge impact.
And was it meant initially to recover costs that we were actually spending for these projects, or wasn't it?
It goes back pretty far if you look at that PSC rate sheet.
Yeah.
And yes, that is always the intent of electric or of any kind of impact fees, but it's just not as sort of like a bright line in an electric utility because, for instance, the water sewer impact fees, which we charge and would continue to charge, you can sort of tie that to expansions in plants and things like that. It's a bit tougher, I think, with the electric utility impact fees. But yes, that's what they're intended for. However, there are a host of other charges to the customers that help us to recover the cost of providing new service to the customers, including, if there's underground work that has to be done, they reimburse us, and, new meter fees and new account fees. And so these are on top of that.
And connectivity fees, as you mentioned, but is this all in the general fund capital programs?
This is only the electric utility.
No, that's what I meant.
No, it's in the electric utility capital program.
Oh, well, in the enterprise fund.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, this is entirely goes to the electric utility capital improvement program.
How large are these fees relative to the total of impact fees that a developer would pay? Is it significant to them?
As a point of reference, we've got one development in the works right now that per each unit, the impact fees are like $20,000 as compared to say like the $4,000 of additional fees for service charges and deposits, et cetera. So they're pretty high. I think the total on this development ran about $160,000 in total on impact fees, and about 40 or 50 on the rest of the charges. So it can be very high for a large commercial development.
Any other discussion?
No, I think it's a minor part of the budget. It's 20 basis points, really, when you get down to it. So I would move for approval.
I'll second the motion. Any discussion?
I'll second that if I can. I can move and vote today.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. I'll support that. Yeah. Because if if we're the only city in the state that's currently charging one of these things, it doesn't look good for this city, I don't think. I mean, we send a good message if we quit doing it to the business community.
Exactly right.
Certainly might encourage more development. Exactly right.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye. Opposed? Passes unanimously.
Excellent. Thank you very much. The next one is, one second, it's going to take me a second to shift paperwork. The next one is your recommendation regarding an award of a loan to BB&T. Our adopted budget for this fiscal year includes a very large capital project to reconstruct Airport Drive on 34th Avenue, and it includes the replacement of the bridge and traffic signals and a host of other things associated with that stretch of road. We have a very large FDOT grant, as a matter of fact, $3.3 million, but the project itself is almost $4.5 million, and so the budget has always accounted for the fact that we would borrow the remaining money. And so we put out an RFP for those funds, and we got back one proposal, despite the fact that we sent it to 21 banks and quite a number of them local banks. We believe, Craig Dunlap and I, because it's just a very small loan, and we've got some other business with BBT, which apparently is what makes them interested in doing business with us. And so based on that response and reviewing the proposal, Craig Dunlap, our financial advisor, is recommending we accept that. It has a fixed interest rate of 2.47% that is valid until past the time frame when council would approve the loan documents. The mechanics of this, if you endorse this recommendation we're making to council, council would approve awarding the loan to BB&T at the council meeting next week. But then for like a month, we have to work with the bonds council, the bank's council, and our bond council to actually prepare the loan documents and bring them to council for approval. The amount of money that we're borrowing, $1.4 million, includes enough money for the issuance costs of the loan, as well as gives us a little bit of money for contingencies on the project. At a $4+ million project, we've set aside, about 10% for change orders and things that will probably happen as we go through the project. And so with that, I'm happy to answer any questions or take your recommendation about this award to BB&T.
Any questions? Or John?
Just one general question. It looks like a clean transaction to me, but since that is the main entrance to the county administration building, was there ever any thought of contacting them to share in the costs? Or is that even possible?
That would be a great question for our public works director. I think that, given that we have the biggest cost share is going to be the FDOT loan. The FDOT grant of almost $3.4 million. Right. I don't know that the county would consider that, but
I think the county would tell us real quick it's a city street, and they are not responsible for that. And we have issues, for example, on the beaches, and they've said no to those. So I think a city street would probably fall within that scope pretty quick. And since we do have the grant,
I understand. I just thought I would be.
What would be the interest and principal payments for the 15 years?
The interest and principal payments for the 15 years run about $114,000, $115,000 a year. That would be funded entirely out of 1 cent sales tax. The only issue is that they are, we did budget around $43,000 a year for these debt service payments because we had planned on a 30-year loan, not thinking about the fact that we can't do a 30-year without a bond, and the bond issuance cost would eat up more than the $1.4 million. So this is a simple bank qualified loan, and the most they're going to go on a dollar amount like this is 15 years. So it's a little higher than the budgeted amount, but nothing that we can't handle within the 1 cent sales tax money.
Any more discussion?
Yeah, just so it sounds to me like on this project, the state is paying about 75% of the total cost through a grant, and that grant means that's money that we keep. We don't have to pay back. Or okay. Yeah. So it sounds like a reasonable deal. We're only paying.
That's actually a grant that the airport helped Public Works secure because of the proximity to the airport. It's an FDOT grant through their aviation program. So yes, that was a huge benefit to us. It's certainly a piece of infrastructure that Monty would tell you is long overdue for a replacement, and to be able to get it so substantially funded by a grant is really a great thing. You're right, about 75%.
Do I have a motion?
I'll move for approval.
Do I have a second?
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Aye.
Thank you. Okay, moving right along. This is the part where we might hit the sand for a few minutes.
Yeah, this might be a little bit more of a discussion.
So this is actually a continuation of a discussion we started back in November. And what I'd like to do really briefly is recap what I think were the most important points of our discussion from back in November, for particularly for the new member of our commission, and then open it up so that we continue talking about what we'd like to recommend to council. The first most important point for me is that we're talking about in this policy the fund balance in the general fund only. The other enterprise funds have different fund balance targets, and many of those targets are externally imposed by debt covenants, by bond rating agencies, and so this is not about the electric utility or the water and sewer. This is specifically about the city's general fund, the city's general operating fund, and the appropriate fund balances within it. The second most important point is that the fund balance that we generate within the general fund is not a recurring revenue source. It does not grow perpetually, and so a central feature of the policy that I've proposed that we talked about before is that it can only be used for one-time expenditures like capital or paying down loans or special projects, and that it should never be programmed for recurring operating expenditures like salaries or operating costs or annual debt service payments because again, you've got a finite amount of money and a recurring cost, and that is really not a good match. And that is a central portion of the GFOA recommendations regarding how to create a fund balance policy that you don't end up essentially spending your fund balance down on a programmed basis beyond where it should be. The policy that I've put in front of you, as we discussed before, calls for sort of a layered approach to the fund balance, not just one number, but three. One amount specifically for emergency expenditures, in our case, typically hurricanes and our matches to state and federal assistance for disasters. A second layer that's budget stabilization. That's the money we dip into if we have to when something unexpected occurs after we've already adopted a budget and a millage rate and we're halfway through the year, something we didn't expect besides an emergency comes along. And then finally, a layer at the bottom of working capital equal to 3 months for simple cash flow needs for that first 3 months of the year before we actually start receiving significant amounts of taxes, et cetera. And then the last piece of this policy that, again, is very much in line with the GFOA recommendations is that there are specific targets for restoring these fund balances if they're used, and timeframes and priority orders, et cetera. If we want to talk about those central pieces again a little bit more, and then talk about the percentages that were proposed by us or by me in the draft policy. The place where this comes into play is really two things. One, we're probably a month or so away from needing to do a budget amendment in our capital programs for the current year, particularly for stormwater projects, because in our general government infrastructure fund, we do not have much money in there for stormwater projects as we awaited the outcome of the discussion about a stormwater utility. And unfortunately, we have stormwater infrastructure that is failing. And so we are going to have to do some sort of a budget amendment to address, not the nice to have projects, but at least the things that are failing. And so certainly a fund balance policy might help us to free up some money for those one-time capital expenditures. Again, a very appropriate use of the money. And secondly, we'd like to see this policy in place before we head into our budgeting activities for 16-17, because it was a topic of discussion last year. No policy in place, no decision about what to do. As we go into 16-17 budget discussions, it'd be nice to have a written policy in place. So that's really the time frame. And with that, I would open it up to whatever you'd like to talk about.
I just have one comment that would be an add-on that I was going to bring up. We had cited previously that there was a storm water consultant, and we do have a preliminary report, and I thought that later in the meeting we could discuss it's a preliminary, just what the concept is, without dwelling on it at the moment, but focus on the use and level of the fund and in the dimensions that Cindy had laid out. So open for discussion on the reserve fund.
Cindy, I'm very supportive of this concept we put together, and it seems like it's virtually the same as we discussed back in the fall. And the only issue I really have, and I think we all need to be aware of, this is just a policy statement. It doesn't bind anybody's hands going forward. We all know that.
Well,
Is that right? It's a general policy.
Well, it depends. We would adopt it.
Right.
And the question is, would we adopt it? This is part of your recommendation as a resolution or an ordinance. If you make it a part of the city's code of ordinances, then it has the force of any other ordinance. And so I would say that's a great thing to consider as part of your recommendation. How does council adopt this as a resolution or an ordinance?
Right. Because the way I read it now, it's another policy statement. Doesn't bind anybody that I can see. No, Jim,
and
at least
frankly,
my observations is.
Yeah. If the council sets a policy and they set us off to adopt or to formulate a budget, we're going to do it within the confines of those policies that the council, whether it's resolution or ordinance. The ordinance really binds the council until they modify the ordinance, and so then it's a city ordinance and a city law. But a policy statement through a resolution passed on to Cindy and myself from the city council that says these will be the parameters in which you work, that's the parameters in which we would work.
It has to be adopted by one or the other in order for me to actually be able to show these restricted balances or committed and assigned balances in my CAFR, because it's required that be adopted by, formally adopted by the highest level of decision-making authority within the city. So if it's just something attached to a letter, I can't actually show these things in my CAFR as being assigned or reserved restricted fund balance.
And from adoption point of view, what's the difference between, and this is a legal question, between just adopting it as is and putting it in an ordinance? What's the difference?
An ordinance binds the council.
Yeah, but how does an ordinance get put in place? I don't know.
Technically, an ordinance would require two readings, and an ordinance is essentially a local law, whereas a resolution is an expression of something that is they feel very strongly about, but it does not have the force of a local law.
Who authorizes the ordinance? I mean, is that a council does that?
Council does that.
Council does that. So council can adopt an ordinance per se.
If your recommendation is this policy and be adopted by ordinance because you want to have the force of law, then the council would take that up, construct an ordinance that would adopt this policy, and then that's how it works.
Okay.
But the council is the only one that can do an ordinance.
Right.
They're also the only ones that can do a resolution.
Yeah.
There are sections of the city's code of ordinance specifically related to budget and budgeting policy. So, I mean, there's a section of the code of ordinances that's appropriate for it. It wouldn't be brand new. There's stuff in there already. So,
the way I'm trying to understand how we're going on this. The way I read it, it suggests that the council could invade the 10% and then repay it back over 4 years by them making that decision, correct?
through a budget amendment, correct.
Just through a budget amendment. So the council could spend up to right now $2 million plus or minus, right, for a specific project, right? Not operating funds, but specific project, correct? It would have to rebuild that fund over the next 4 years, correct?
Well,
that's the way it reads, anyway.
Sort of. The idea here is that every year you would sit down and compare these targets to the CAFR, and you would say this is truly extra money above and beyond the targets. And that money would be on the table to be used either through a budget amendment or to be incorporated into subsequent year's budget process. The budget stabilization is really there if you have something happen to you mid-year that you didn't expect and you end up way over budget. In other words, you would have to dip into that. You don't have a choice. It's not intended to be programmed use of the funds, but more of, we had a budget thing happen to us we didn't expect. The perfect example is dunes. We don't budget for repairs or replenishment of the dunes anymore. It's so hit or miss. It depends on the storms. So that budget stabilization, in a perfect world where everything else in the budget came in on target, and all of a sudden we had a November storm and we spent $200,000 or $300,000 putting sand back on the dunes, that would dip into that budget stabilization. But it wouldn't be a programmed expenditure; it would be a unexpected.
Well, that's what I want to be clear about. Well, because the way I read it now, it appears to me that if the council makes a decision, they can make a policy decision to invade that 10% for anything they like other than operating expenditures.
Again,
that's what it appears like.
well, again, the way it's
And
written,
I'm not arguing with it, but I wanted to make sure that's what we're saying.
it's not well. Maybe then I'm not saying it well. Basically, the determination up in Section 5, determination that you have an excess amount is a programmed thing. You take the CAFR, you compare it to your budget, you've got an excess amount. You, council, do whatever you'd like
I understand
within
that.
the confines.
You and I are clear about that, right?
But yes, could they adopt a budget amendment mid-year that dipped into the budget stabilization,
That's
knowing they had 4 years to replenish it? Certainly.
That's what it
And
appears
there's no
like.
way to prevent that.
So they do have discretion to spend. The way this reads now, they do have discretion in this policy to spend $2 million right now if they make that election. Well,
Yes, and they always do. I mean, there's nothing, and there's nothing you could construct that would remove their discretionary power to amend a budget within the current year, which they have by Florida statute. To forget fund balance, forget this fund balance policy. Council could right now for 15-16 amend the budget and add $1 million worth of expenses and say, as long as we have money to cover it, that's a legitimate budget amendment. That's something that you can't do away with a local ordinance because it's inherent in Florida statutes. They have the ability to amend the budget within any given year.
Well, I just want to make a point in the CAFRA. What our auditors say, that the entire $9.5 million is discretionary today.
That's right.
Because of what I'm saying, because of the Florida
The entire.
No, that's right.
Yeah.
But
because of
without
Florida statutes.
having these kind of guidelines that.
The only thing I'm trying to clarify here,
Oh, I understand.
Mr. Glory, is that when we talk about, an example, we had about $187,000 left for expenditures over, and they can spend it any way they want to. But when you read it carefully, they really can spend the $2 million spread, and all they have to do is then budget over the next 4 years to pay it all back. Whereas if they invade the working capital, the other fourth, if they go above the $2 million, say they're going to spend $3 million, right? $2 million coming out of the 10%, $1 million coming out of the 25%, right? The way it reads, the first $2 million would have to come back over 4 years. The next $1 million would have to come over 3 years.
Two.
Well, so, I mean, you see what I'm saying? There's
You're absolutely right.
the way it reads, the burden is on the right point, making it come back faster on the working capital, because that's where our exposure would be, right? We need the working capital. So that should have to come back faster, no doubt about it. So I'm just trying to be clear. There's nothing in this thing that I see binds the city council from spending $3 million this next year. Boom.
Or 7 or 8.
Yeah, or-
Nothing.
Right.
And
The way I
you
read
make
it.
an excellent point.
Yeah.
No matter how you adopt this, you can't eliminate that right of the council to spend all of their available funds if they so desire, because that's inherent in Florida statutes and in
That's
their
why,
authority.
even if we had an ordinance, it would be the same situation. So we're putting a policy in place, but the reality is we're not binding anybody's hands, right? That I can see.
I mean,
Dan?
Glenn, I don't see it that way. I think,
Don't you?
well, the way I look at it in the background material, they're asking very tacitly, approve a new ordinance that adopts this type of fund policy that's sponsored by this Government Finance Officers Association. I assume they're out of Chicago. That's where they're, anyway. You want that ordinance passed. And if they pass that ordinance, then this council in the future, they're inhibited from going into the fund unless they vote out of this ordinance. They would have to vote it out if they could get the votes. I agree with you. The city council can do whatever they want to do if they have 3 votes. But if they don't have those 3 votes, excuse me,
3 votes.
they're bound by this fund balance. And if you look at Figure 3, it's really a small amount that they could go into out of a fund balance of just under $10 million. Under that example, if it was a recurring fund, a non-recurring expense, that's all they could use out of the fund balance. Am I right? 168,000.
Yeah.
That's why I don't like it.
But
I mean, this. Go ahead.
Yes and no. Okay, the point that Mr. Brevant is making is well taken. If you look, let's look at Attachment A. Look at Attachment A, Section 8.
Yeah.
And look at the very last paragraph. Okay. Now you've gone through your $2 million. Let's say all these things happen at once. You had a hurricane, and now you've had some sort of unsuspected issue. But if you look at that last paragraph, it says, "In no circumstances shall the unassigned fund balance be budgeted or appropriated to dip below 25%. However, if the city's fund balance drops below 25% due to unforeseen circumstances, it's the intent of the council that the fund balance be replenished within 2 years." You cannot, by Florida law, limit the city council from its ability to amend a budget if something they didn't expect happens
Right. That's the way I read
to
it.
continue the
So-
orderly operation of the government. And I don't know what that might be. We could probably think of disasters. I don't like to spend time doing that. But if something happened mid-year and the council absolutely had to appropriate all of its fund balance in order to continue the operation of the government, they have the right to do that, regardless of any fund balance policy under Florida statutes that allows them to amend budgets as long as they remain with sufficient.
That's the way I read it.
Okay, and
Yeah.
that makes my point. In view of the Florida statute, what's the purpose of this new policy, this fund balance policy?
The purpose of this policy is several things. One, it establishes an intent with regard to planned expenditures. In other words, if something unexpected happens, you can't tie the city council's hands in solving that problem. But it makes it very clear that you cannot plan for a budget that completely depletes the fund balance on recurring expenses. That is really the difference. The other huge difference is that without an adopted formal policy, you cannot show your reserves as part of your CAFR. You are not allowed to, by GASB standards, show any reserves in your CAFR, which is the reason that right now pretty much our whole fund balance in our general fund in our CAFR shows as unrestricted because we have no formally adopted restrictions on said fund balance. And so I think Section 6 is important. Section 5 is important. Again, you're talking about 2 things. You're talking about this idea that we came up with last budget season that somehow we have extra. Well, this determines how much that quote-unquote extra is and says that every year when you enter your budget workshops, we are going to tell you, we're going to determine a certain amount that we consider extra, and we'll go ahead and budget that, but only for certain types of expenses. The thing that Mr. Brevant is talking about is the unforeseen circumstance where it becomes necessary to go deeper than that, and that's something you can't limit through a policy.
I'm not quite sure I agree with that, Cindy, and only because the way it's written. I'm not at all sure when I read it that City Council cannot make a planned decision to invade the 10%. You're suggesting it's only the unplanned. I don't think that's the case. I think the way I read it, if they make a decision, they need to spend $1 million for upgrading the building or something. If they plan it, they can invade it, but they do have to repay it over 4 years. That's the way I read it. It's not just unplanned.
Again, that was not the way it was intended, so I need to have another look at it, because if you look at Section 5,
Understand, I read it
that's
carefully.
the section that talks about determining how much you have to spend in any given year. The last section was really about if something happens and you go below that minimum. So I can certainly reword it, but that was not the intent at all. The intent was there's a planned amount you can put on the table every year, and then there's this things happen, so that if for some reason things happen and you dip below, here's the other circumstance. Let's say you plan to use, in accordance with Section 5, you plan to use $1 million of it. during your budget season, and now something you didn't expect happens,
Hits you.
and you dip below into that budget stabilization, okay?
Right.
Do you abandon the thing you planned on, or do you go ahead and do both, dip below into the budget stabilization, and bring it back over the course of 3 or 4 years? So if that, I can try to reword this a little bit. That was really more the intent.
I think I would really look at verbiage a little bit. I think in my head, any city council now can work around this paragraph a little bit by planning it. And I'm not saying that's wrong, but the way it's read, it's not specifically saying the unplanned. You're referencing the unplanned. I'm saying I think it's possible that this is sort of authorizing the use of the 10%. And
Well, and again, I could tighten up the wording. If you look at Section 4, where it talks about, it defines the budget stabilization reserve, it says it's a buffer for unexpected impacts to provide stability. It doesn't say it's something that you can plan. I will take a look at the wording, but I will go ahead and concur with what you've said. There is no way in which we can write and adopt this policy that will make it so that council does not have the authority and the ability to spend fund balance as they see fit to run this government. And Jim may want to weigh in on that, but I mean, they themselves have asked for this policy.
No,
they intend.
Who asked for it?
The council.
yeah.
Okay.
The bottom line is it takes 2 meetings and the whole ordinance goes away if the council chooses to do so.
That's right.
I mean, even if they caught up in the words and the verbiage and, can we do this, can we do that, they say, out with this.
Throw it
And so, I mean, this is what we're doing is setting a policy that if you're asking who it really applies to, Cindy and I. We're the ones that we can't go out here and artificially spend money or do anything without council approval. And
Right.
we would be presenting a budget within the guidelines, whether it's a resolution or an ordinance. From my perspective, that doesn't make any difference. A resolution says this is our policy of the city, and the council can do whatever they want to. The ordinance is actually a law, and you get into this definition of terms, Glenn, that you were talking about.
Good.
And the city attorney says, well, wait a minute, I don't read it that way, and we happen to have another city attorney or something, then it gets all balled up. But the bottom line is, well, I'll just rewrite the ordinance for you. And
That's why it's a waste of time adopting it.
Yeah,
It's a waste of time.
I think the good thing about a reserve policy is it applies to Cindy and I. It planning is the thing, and it also tells us what that reserve in the budget balances can be used for.
That's correct.
The worst case scenario, we go out and hire 2 more police officers based on the fact that we have a budget balance this year, and next year we don't have a budget balance, and then I'm facing 2 guys that we're going to lay off. This at least puts it into the writing of where we're going to spend the money, and one-time capital expenditures. Build a lifeguard tower or whatever it is a very simple thing, and it's a directive. Right now, we have no real directive as to what we're doing. Right. Now, that's not to say that I'm a big advocate for a fund balance policy. Don't get me wrong. Cindy and I have had this conversation before, and what it does is encourages you run your fund balance down, because then we'll start figuring out projects that we can spend fund balance for. But again, it's a change, and it's just a different view and a different philosophy. To me, the stronger the fund balance, the stronger the city looks. I feel very proud that we have a very strong fund balance here. We have it in electric, we have it in water and sewer. To me, that's one of those things that you do as a manager, is you try to build those reserves. It's a little change in policy for me, that now I'm trying to figure out how to legally spend that fund balance, and so which I don't have any problem with. I mean, if that's the policy, then I can do that. I can spend just as well as I can.
Easier to spend, Jim.
Yeah. Spending becomes a little easier, except when you get into the debate of what you're going to spend it on. Then you have
and I agree with what the city manager has said 100%. I, too, think that when it came up last year, I made it clear as well. I'm very conservative. I have no issue with our fund balances as they sit now. I have a big concern with starting down the path of thinking they're like something we should be spending. But more importantly, this fund balance policy, where it does make me feel a little better, is it makes it clear that if we are going to spend them, them, if we are going to annually say, here's an amount we'd like to throw on the table to fold into the budget, that one, it could only be for one-time expenditures, and two, it would be based on something where, it was, we're going to keep a certain amount around and we're only going to spend what's extra of that. Some of the conversation we had last year about fund balance simply being the fill-in number for whatever you wanted to spend in operating expenditures to lower tax rates, I consider very problematic, because that just is, And so I agree. I'm happy where they are.
Yeah.
I wish we could leave them, but this kind of policy makes it clear what they should be spent on and what we feel comfortable with as a minimum level.
I feel strongly about it too. I do think that it's a helpful guide for new city elected officials. It helps to understand what the company, the city is operating under, because it does look like you throw out $9 billion. Sounds like we got a lot of money. But when you start analyzing it carefully, it's not that much money. And so from a new elected official's point of view, this certainly should be something he's read before we start adopting budgets. Right? That's from my perspective, it's helpful from an elected official's point of view.
It would seem to me the payback provision makes it that it would not be abused, Gus. You have to pay it back.
And the payback is a very good provision in this, and it's something that we do support in the fact that it would force us, at least administratively, to put money in the upcoming budgets to pay back anything we would spend.
Absolutely. Right. Without it, you don't have any teeth. You have to have it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I will tell you, again, I included their guidance. I modeled this after what the Government Finance Officers Association offered up as what they consider best practices. Yeah. And the mere adoption of a fund balance policy is considered a best practice. It's something like bond rating agencies like to see. It shows that you've given some thought to, hey, there's the minimum acceptable levels, and you're not just going to start chucking that money in whenever you run short, and that, when you go to borrow money, as, it looks good. So it's a good thing to have. I mean, as long as it's, I think, crafted in a way that
I concur. I think it's a good policy.
But it can't ever be ironclad.
I think you're basically describing good business practice and trying to put it in the form of a policy. Mm-hmm. As I went through this past week, trying to absorb all the pieces of this, and I had to simplify it so that I could keep a handle of it, there are 3 different proposals here. One is for an emergency fund. Anybody that lives in a condo or an association here knows about the reserves. And this is basically what I think you're trying to say for the city. We need an emergency reserve. And I think generally the population should understand that if you describe it in terms of we need to have reserve for some emergency that comes up. I don't know about the amount. The second part, the cash flow, that's a business practice. You have to be sure to keep enough cash on hand to cover the expenses. So do I. I have an annual budget where I can divide everything by 12, but the cash flow is different. And I think, to me, that's all you're asking for, is recognition that I have to have enough cash on hand to handle the variation in cash flow. And to me, that's just a reasonable policy for business practices. I don't know that it should get any disagreement from it. The third, my experience in organizations is that they don't like for you to keep a surplus balance. You're charging too much fees or you're pulling in too much revenue. They don't like that. So what we're trying to do is describe a slush fund or someplace you can go, and so that we have a policy that says we can have a little bit of a fund balance, whether that be $1 million or $2 million or whatever it is. We have a fund balance, so that if we go over, we're covered. We don't have to go back and change the budget. If we go under on revenue, we don't have to go back and change the budget. But it would be clearer to me if you said we want that amount to be, say, $1 million. If we have more than that, we can go back and do a budget amendment and spend it. If we have less than that, we'll have to make it up next year. Rather than trying to say we'll spend it, write up the policy of what we can spend it for, just say we want to keep an amount, this amount as a surplus. If we're over that, we can appropriate it with a budget amendment. If we're under that, we're going to have to make it up next year.
So are you saying instead of a percentage, go like we did with the emergency reserves, go with a flat amount?
Whatever you want to set that as an amount or a percentage, and just say that is our goal to have that. Not to dip into, but just to have it so that we can handle fluctuations in the budget.
Do that. That might make it. To your point, that might make it easier to read. We've got $2 million for emergencies.
We can't,
We've got $1 million or $2 million for budget stabilization, and we need 25% for working.
We can't tell the council what to do, but we can recommend that says this is the purpose behind it.
Yeah. One of our little challenges, just so we don't lose total perspective of, I guess, where at least I'm coming from, and possibly Cindy, if you're dealing with trying to program out, plan out, let's say 5 years or 10 years, let's take a new wastewater treatment plant going on the air base as opposed to where it is. Under this policy, someone could interpret that they are encouraged to spend the money once you hit that, let's say it's $1 million. You get $1.2 million, you need to spend that $200,000. And that's something we need to make sure that we all understand what we're doing. And then in 2022, when you want to build a sewer plant, you don't have any money. And so it's one of those challenges.
And that actually is one of the choices. If you look in Section 5, when you determine each year that you have some quote-unquote excess amount above the 25% and the $2 million and the $2 million, and there's still more than that, then you have the choice of either spending it in the current year with a budget amendment, spending it in the subsequent year with the budget adoption, or simply leaving it in the general fund balance to earn interest and roll forward to some future use. So you have the ability within this policy to do what you're saying. Okay, let's leave that because down the road here in about 5 years, we're going to need a big chunk of money for X, Y, Z.
But the question is, are you encouraging it?
It would seem perhaps a floor amount might be appropriate as a set dollar amount. But I could see if as a percentage of a budget, yes, as a budget gets larger, your emergencies can get larger. Mm-hmm. It just means the scope of government is bigger. So
that's why I made it a percentage.
I think the percent is good because it allows it to grow as government is, as the size of the community, whatever it is growing. Mm-hmm. So.
Yeah. I don't want to bring the subject up again, but I want to be sure everybody understands. I'm not enamored with the fact that we have a fund balance, but okay, because I will go back to my accountants and they subtract out our liability on behalf of other benefits. And when I read the balance sheet, this $9 million is $4 million negative because our accountants have wiped out our cash and applied it against what we are accumulating is a liability of $1.5 million a year, and nobody talks about it. And we don't have a plan for paying it. And we tried to get it in last year's budget, and we got blown out of the water because we had other expenditures. Well, the problem is we're always going to have other expenditures. So we've got on the books, and I don't like it. I love this cash statement we get. This one here shows $11 million. What it doesn't show is $16 million in other payroll benefits that are on our books as liability and not one plan for repaying it. Not a plan. And when I amortize just the $16 million without considering the other 17, this $16 million on the books today costs $1 million a year to amortize in 26 years. No plan. And yet, some of our elected officials tell me we're wealthy. We're a wealthy city. That's what they say. No wonder the public's confused.
Wait till you see this year's CAFR, because wait till you see this year's CAFR. This year is the first year that we're required by the GASB to show the entire unfunded pension liability on the books. And up to this point in time, the balance sheets do not show any portion of the unfunded pension liability because we've always made our annual required contributions. Right. Well, the new GASB pronouncement requires, beginning with this fiscal year, that the entire unfunded pension liability appear on the balance sheet. And so that will be part of it as well. So certainly I'm
You mean the post-employment operating costs, the POB?
No, I mean the pension.
The pension plan.
The pension on top of it.
And the post will come a couple of years from now, probably.
2 years. Correct.
It's coming.
No.
But there's where I get exasperated. This is not liquid funds. until we have a plan to figure out how we are going to service our debt properly. Right now, we're not.
But we are trying to reserve this fund balance for things that you have to pay. You know, if you have a hurricane, you
I
have
agree,
to pay it,
but-
even if the pension's
But I
losing
think what
10
we
years
should all
from now.
recognize is that some of this $11 million is really committed already, because we are kicking the ball down the wall. We had 30 years to amortize it. Now we had 27. Now we're going to have 26, and we're going to have 25. And this burden just gets worse. Unless, and we had a windfall last year because we shoved everybody into Medicare. I'm not sure we'll have a windfall next year, and I'm not sure we won't have a catastrophe next year if something happens in Congress.
Well, you
But I don't
know, from a cash standpoint, and I will just say this just to allay some concerns, and I don't disagree with you, but you know, we have enough cash annually to pay our portion of the health insurance premiums for the retirees. It amounts to, you know, a couple $100,000 a year in the general fund. The real issue there is that if you believe the actuary's version of how much it accumulates to as a total liability, do we establish a trust fund and begin putting money aside the same way we did with the pension, so that we can earn interest on the money and have that interest earnings available to help defray the costs in the future? And I mean, certainly that's a concern. And again, when we get to budget season this year, we'll put those numbers back in the mix for our budget based on your recommendation to see if we can begin funding that trust fund, because I don't disagree with you that that's, you know, something we
I just want us all to understand that I'm not enamored with what we're saying here as liquid funds. And I'm certainly going to push this next year around again to get it back in the budget. We have to begin to start doing what responsible cities should do.
But as you said, we've already made that recommendation. We made it strongly.
We're going to make it again this year.
Well,
If I have my way.
Of course we are. I mean, it has to be done. Council member, please.
Yeah, Randy Old. What I was going back to was some of the reasons we were pushing for a policy was that one of the ideas was to spend some of that $9 million on reoccurring expenses, and then the debate was over whether or not that was a wise decision to do, and it was it affecting did it end up with a unbalanced budget for the year or not? And that was what the debate was, and so what we're trying to do is clarify what we can spend it for, and reoccurring expenses is what we ended up agreeing that we shouldn't spend it for, because it ends up with a non-balanced budget, and it looks bad from the outside where we are budgeting a deficit. And that was the debate, and that's why we were asking for a clarification on this. And again, a policy on how to use that money and what the level of it should be. So I think it's very good to have this debate and to go through this and come up with a policy that we can follow. Yes, we can get around it. Yes, we have the power. We have more power than you do, so we can get around it. That's right. But I think it's better if we have guidelines and have a policy that allows us to bounce our ideas, our budget process against these policies. And so I think that's what we're asking for.
Yeah.
No, I agree.
Yeah. Mr. Old?
Yeah.
Do you agree with this principle that this government agency puts out here? It's on one of the pages. It says that all of the fund balance policies and the best practices that are available seem to agree on one thing. It's not advisable to use a non-recurring revenue source, such as our fund balance, to support a recurring expenditure. Do you believe in that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. Do you know of any current member of the city council who doesn't believe in that? You don't have to name names, but
No, we had a debate about it last year, and there was a debate about just the accounting terms and whether or not how that resulted and whether or not it was resulted in a deficit or not. And so there was a debate about the reoccurring things.
And when you finalized your budget last year, you didn't go into the fund balance, did you?
No.
Okay. So doesn't that prove council's action?
No,
prove
actually,
that you don't need an ordinance codifying this? Because you made your decision.
No.
There was there was a movement underway to raise the millage. some members on the council wanted to have a millage increase.
Yes.
I think a minority, I'm not sure how that vote went, but there was a lot of people who opposed that millage increase. Finally, you had to come up with a modified millage increase, I believe.
Correct.
And rather than go into your fund balance, I think some of that spending was put off. Am I correct?
Correct.
Okay. So you came to a decision, probably the best decision that the council could make based upon the number of different opinions that were expressed at that time.
Right.
So you proved you don't need an ordinance codifying this principle. As long as you base your budget on this principle and you act upon that, why do you need to codify it?
There wasn't
Actually,
a principle.
You
for
made
that.
the decision. They made the decision specifically asking for this. They said, because we don't have a policy,
Yeah.
we're going to go ahead and not do it right now.
Yeah.
But
didn't have a
before we
principle.
come
That's
to
not-
next year's budget,
That
we want a
wasn't our-
policy.
That wasn't our principle. We didn't have any principles.
Well, you-
Excuse me.
Yeah.
Doesn't sound right, does it?
Or assistant principals either.
Even if you're obeying this without a written policy,
That's right.
Why not write the policy? Because Cindy said third
Because-
parties
right,
like to see it.
The reason I-
We're
that was
abiding by
actually
it
this-
anyway. Write it so the third parties.
That was the
like-
specific direction that council gave staff.
Yeah.
We're going to adopt this budget, and we're not going to use it now, but before next budget season, please prepare and take to the Finance Commission a policy
Yeah.
so that we will have a policy.
Yeah, absolutely, yeah.
That was part of the decision.
Okay, but
Yeah.
the way I see it, if you put this into an ordinance, you're laying the groundwork to make it easier for councils in the future to raise the millage. You're making it easier because you're putting it in writing. We can't go into the fund balance. They may have a good reason to go into the fund balance, but because of this ordinance that's there, hey, they got to raise the millage.
Well, I'm not here to debate with you, but what I look at it differently in saying that there are very good reasons for keeping a balance, be it like we do personally for our cash flow or for our emergency or whatever. And the city has those same responsibilities because we got to protect.
That's right,
all
and
the
no one
people
wants
here.
to destroy the fund balance.
Yeah.
That's not what we're saying.
Yeah.
But you don't need an ordinance to protect that fund balance. Every year, the council makes a decision on how much they should spend,
Yeah.
and they got their options.
And you can say that about any kind of business or anything like that. You don't need a policy because we've got the power. But policy really helps a lot in guiding new people like me coming into a position, and I don't really understand about what goes on, why we have this kind of a fund balance. It's really nice to have a policy that surrounds it and the reasoning behind that. So it really helps a lot. Or people in your positions who are turning over all the time and weren't there when we decided all this stuff. It's nice to have those policies in place.
I couldn't agree more with you. I think we need the policies.
Yeah.
They're great learning tools and great directional tools. And
this discussion is really good to have.
Yeah, we need the policy too.
Well, it's also helpful for the public to know that there are some best business
Yeah.
practices and guidelines.
Yeah.
And for, as you said, I totally endorse it.
And maybe we could get to a discussion where instead of talking about $9 million in fund balances, begin to talk about what is real. $4 million in funds for working capital. That's about what it is. That's not $9 million. Maybe we could clarify the communication.
Well, and just as one comment from September 2015 on page 8 of the Red Book, and on Rage, 3 months later, the general fund cash and investment went from $9.9 million to $11.2 million. I didn't understand that.
That's because we get like almost all of our tax revenue in November, late November, and early December. So we have nothing for almost 3 months, 2.5 months, and then we get everything. And very little trickles in after the first of the year. So the first quarter is always distorted in terms of cash.
Yeah, that leads to the point, what you're just saying, that if you broke it down, what you would see is the base, $2 million, the middle, $2 million, and then the working capital changing. That's all you're seeing. And the working capital go up and down by quarter.
Yeah.
So,
But in actuality, if you looked at it month over month, there, and I've done this analysis because
Sure.
I'm working on some investment policies, it dips down in the October-November timeframe
Sure.
by over $3 million on a regular basis.
And that would
So
be
that's why it
helpful for-
can't be zero. It can't be lower than 3 or 4 because it actually goes down to -3.
and that would be helpful for people to see from time to time, particularly people like us that are sitting on it. So you're really seeing the swing in cash flow.
Yeah, well, yeah, because it's, as you said, it was 73 million in end of September and 70.3 million in the and because of the uneven, as John was saying, you just can't divide by 12. Because some of these, the police pension is what, $800,000 on the first, and a number of our debt payments are on the first of the year. Insurance payments, which are front end loaded. So all of the above, and that's why we'll get into it. I won't belabor it, but the first quarter data is one has to take great care in trying to interpret it. That's all I'm saying.
There seems to be consensus that a policy is a good thing.
Right.
Why isn't an ordinance better than a good thing? Procedurally, how does that bind the council or future government entities? What's the advantage or disadvantage of having it be an ordinance?
I think I have to agree with the city manager from staff's perspective, whether it's an ordinance or a resolution. When we craft our first draft of the budget, we will craft one that fulfills it. In other words, we'll figure out how much quote unquote excess revenue there is, and we'll put it in there as something that can be spent on capital projects, and we'll suggest some projects. So from staff's perspective, we will follow it either way in crafting the proposed budget. How much weight it carries with council from their perspective in adopting the budget. Again, technically an ordinance has the force of law. Think of it this way. There's a lot of our zoning regulations that are ordinances and not resolutions, meaning that council doesn't have the ability to simply, do something
Ignore
different
them, yeah.
because it's part of the ordinance. But at the end of the day, we can't craft it in a way that removes council's authority to do what they need to do to run the government.
So an ordinance really has no more power than a procedure or
It has
policy.
more power than a resolution, but an ordinance can be amended with 2 readings and or eliminated.
I differ. I think the ordinance does have more power because psychologically it's in place, and it's public. Where this may not be public, it's buried in a file. So the ordinance do seem to have more power. The council spends more time writing them. The attorneys spend a lot of time writing them, right, to make it conform to state law. So it must have more power than just the straight.
It's local law.
Yeah.
It gets codified into the book of ordinances, meaning that's right there. In all the other would go in the section with all the other ordinances regarding budget policies and amendments and things like that. And a resolution, once it's adopted, you have to go actually find that specific resolution. They're not all codified somewhere where you can look in the big code of ordinances.
Public ought to be able to find the ordinance a lot easier than they could find
a policy.
Yeah,
and a policy can be, as you said, it would be vetted by the attorneys and be in conformance, and therefore articulated precisely what the standards are, as opposed to a policy which can be somewhat cloudy at times or given to interpretation. But the ordinance would be specific to what the interpretation and what the full meaning of the terms are. Policy can be more
I tend
flexible.
to think we shouldn't have a policy myself. I think we should have a policy, but not an ordinance. Because once we get the lawyers in, they're going to define every word now.
That's what I've been saying.
Yeah, we're going to have to define every word.
But again, attachment
I don't
A.
think that's the intent.
Attachment A to this document, which I wrote with the eye toward it belonging either as a resolution or an ordinance. It's set up and numbered and crafted in a way it can be an ordinance just as easily. And when we say the attorneys, we're talking about Wayne and Peggy, and I will work with Wayne and Peggy to satisfy whatever concerns they have about the language. But, again, the language in the memo is sort of, hey, with this and that and the other. Mm-hmm. The language in attachment A was very much intended to be specific and to be adoptable by either resolution or ordinance. So that would actually be the proposed ordinance, is these 2 pages. And so certainly we could work with the city attorney with any concerns they might have. So,
All right. Well, I didn't want to interrupt. That's such a good conversation. But, one of the purposes that we do this is that a lot of times the staff will prepare a budget and they'll get, neck deep in a budget, and then they'll finally come to council, and then council will say, well, we'd like to see a policy this way. And, one of the frustrations that we had during the last budget season was that, we had a budget that was almost already all put together, and then it was given to us. And then somehow we had to go through the whole thing and find cuts, additions, and make fine-tunements to it. And, we only had a couple of weeks to do it. And it puts us under the gun. So perhaps we put these things out there and we say, this is our policy. We'd like to make sure that when you put a budget together, that we don't end up with, another $500,000, $750,000 that we just stick into the reserves. From my perspective, the whole purpose is that, when you come to setting millage, let's not set a millage that, puts a lot of money into the reserves that you don't need to put there in the first place. That was my perspective. I don't want to see budgeting for a surplus that you don't need. And if you go back over the budget books, every year, this recent one, I'm seeing $70,000 in cash and investments. 2 years it was $63 million. Every year we just keep going up and up and up and keep euthanizing this money and just sticking it in the bank. My purpose is to see a stop to that. Stop collecting money that you don't need. That's my whole purpose. The message that we'd like to send here to the staff is that let's have a policy in place or an ordinance in place so that when the budget comes that we don't end up in that situation again.
But that also means that we need a budget for proper expenses. And that's where we're... So, which may very well mean we have to cut expenses or raise the taxes. That's what it comes down to.
Right.
Yeah.
And it makes it easier, I think, for a millage increase to be passed if you have this thing codified. Because they've got a wall. They've got a ceiling off of the fund. You can't go into that fund for these.
See, Dan, I sort of
expenses.
disagree with that. And that maybe puts more pressure on us to all look at the expenses carefully. You're correct.
I'm all in favor of that.
Yeah, well, you're correct, but still a reality is that the city council has already got a wall against them by raising taxes. Nobody in the city wants to raise taxes. I don't care what you do. These guys, elected officials, are getting their brains kicked in talking about tax increases. Right?
I don't look at it that way. I don't have any problem every year and whenever it comes in June, July, of having a good, frank discussion on the budget. The revenue, the expenses, have people go up there on the podium and they say, this is what we need. We have one areas of the city saying, we need this for parks, we need this for police and beaches. That's what the city council is for. And last year they made the decision, we're not going to go into reserves. And they did it without any of this policy becoming part of an ordinance.
I have a note in the margin on mine that says now we.
You didn't go into reserves
purpose.
last year.
We're doing it on purpose. We're setting this aside.
Unless I'm
purpose.
No,
before it was.
My
Go
apologies.
ahead.
The point is that we added to the reserves.
Oh.
So really, we collected too much in taxes.
Okay.
That was the whole point. If you have a balanced budget, you don't add to your reserves. You don't subtract from your reserves. It's balanced.
Okay. Well, I'm not in favor of increasing the reserves either. I didn't understand that. I thought they stayed the same.
We didn't budget to increase the reserves. And again, that goes back to the beginning part of this.
Well,
Occasionally, the reserves go up at the end of the year because you've estimated revenues, you've estimated expenditures, and one or both is different than what you estimated. And in the last few years, we've been off by maybe 1%. So in the last few years, fund balances have increased. The intent of this policy is to keep the fund balances the same all the time. And so what would happen every year is we had quote-unquote extra money coming into budget season, we would have not only our regular revenues and expenses, but we would have some extra money that could be put over in the capital projects fund, or we could do a one-time thing with. Coming up at the end of the year with a budget, expenditures, and revenues that are different than what you originally budgeted is something you're never going to eliminate entirely unless you can find a way to be 100% accurate on your estimates of revenues and expenses, and we typically run about 98 or 99% accurate, which is pretty good.
if you don't want to increase the reserves, I'm all in favor of that. don't raise the millage as much as you did, or lower the electric rates a little bit. I know that's not easy to do, but I'm all in favor. We don't need any more reserves than what we absolutely need.
And Dan, or everybody, now from the person who is responsible for putting the budget together, I think what Cindy said, we need to really remember, you're never going to be 100% right on target with your budget. Being conservative, my theory is I always wanted to be on the short end of the stick as opposed to the long end of spending the money. And so we've made great efforts in training department directors. If you absolutely don't need it, don't do it. The federal government works on a theory that if I'm budgeted $100,000 and you roll around to June, and July is your new fiscal year, in June you spend $100,000 because I know what's going to happen in the next year. And so, that you just got to make sure that we all understand what we're doing here. When we present a budget and it's $20 million budget, we're not going to hit it right at $20 million. You're either going to spend too much or you're going to collect too much. It's always going to be one of those others. And a lot of it is contingent upon what happens during that fiscal year and how creative we come and what things we need. And so that's just my perspective of what we're doing. And on the policy would be good. I agree. I mean, we in government need policies. That's just the way that we operate. And I believe it should be an ordinance, as if I was going to adopt this thing, because I think it makes the council at least take, if they're going to get outside of this perspective, take 2 meetings to change the direction, as opposed to, well, it's a resolution, so we'll keep on trucking.
Well, and as you said, that when the economy took a toboggan ride, it really created a lot of the pressure in the city. Now that it's turning around, that's one of the reasons that some of this extra revenue is coming in, because and it's not only the millage, obviously, but it's the appraised values, as well as some of beginning to look at some of the other use taxes, whether it's utilities or the various other usage taxes, communications and so forth, that in fact are flowing into the general fund above what, as we're saying, is that you just cannot predict the future. Who can predict the future of gasoline? The city, in fuel, gas, and oil, in all of its entities, enterprise and non-enterprise, has $1 million in gas and fuel and diesel, talking about the marina, as the total number. And we are running in the city for the first quarter with the fuel prices has spent 14%. As opposed to 25, and as of today, gasoline wholesale per gallon is below $1 for the first time. So that's just an example of how you cannot grapple with it and presume in any of those line items. And excuse me, John, did you have a comment before with all of the?
No, I'm satisfied.
Okay.
Well, I don't know about that, but I'm finished.
If we could, just for a minute, let's go back to the very first page of this. Does everyone have this memo, the very first page? Because we've touched on something that I want to make really, really clear in this discussion. Look at the graph at the bottom of the page. And this is what the city manager is referring to. If you look at fiscal 10 and 11, and even the year before that, and even the year before that, starting with about 08, 09, but 10 and 11 in particular, when I came on board in July of 2011, we were headed toward being over budget in that fiscal year by almost $1 million. Okay, with no plan. What we actually ended up doing was ending the fiscal year with our fund balance going down by almost $600,000. If you look, the subsequent years, what we've done through through a combination of things, through quarterly reviews, through budgetary controls, through the city manager's direction that he's spoken of to the various departments that if you don't have to, you shouldn't spend it. It's not, let's get to August and go out there and fulfill our budgetary expectation. We've come to a place where for the last couple of years, fund balances have gone up. And actually that $1.2 million is distorted because if anyone remembers, that was the year we had to put back some money that we took out the prior year for a double payment of debt. And so we've gone from a situation where 1, 2, 3 years running, there were pretty substantial decreases in fund balance because we adopted a budget that we had no intention of living within and decreased fund balance to a situation where we've stayed conservative within the also conservative budgets that we've adopted. And so across the 11 years here, the fund balance actually fell in 5 of those. So it is not a programmed revenue source that will always go up.
Mr. Chairman, I'll make a motion for adoption of Cindy's right up here on the fund balance policy. And I'll make a motion for its adoption as an ordinance in lieu of what you said, Mr. Spector, and what I'm hearing. I would like a clarification, Cindy, that on this planned versus unplanned, but that's another whole issue. But
yeah, I actually had a couple of notes from our last discussion as to suggestions of verbiage that we could add to 6 and to 8 that would help clarify. So certainly I could always do that and bring it back one more time for you to look at or take it forward on that basis.
We can have a discussion, but if it would be brought back with the clarifications, and fortunately we do have the 2 council members here, Mayor and Vice Mayor, and as a result, the alternative of a policy versus ordinance has certainly been made aware. But if we could come back, and I would second your motion, pending the rewritten language that would come back to us in terms of an ordinance.
I would accept your modification of my resolution. So,
any discussion?
Didn't Cindy say that it was written as an ordinance?
Yes, as an ordinance.
Yeah.
I concur with some clarification. For example, the maintaining of a certain balance is the goal in the budget stabilization, because sometimes where it's written, it looks like we could spend the whole thing.
So once you're done with your deliberation on the motion, if I could recap what I think are the changes that you guys have asked for,
there we go.
Okay.
That'll help me.
All right.
John, I'm not clear on what you just said.
My point earlier was that this budget stabilization reserve should be we should agree on a 10% or a certain amount. And then anything that's over that, then they can make a budget amendment and could use that year. But you don't want to try to use the whole amount. You want to maintain that cushion. Does that make sense? If you had said that it's going to be 10%, which was, say, $2 million, and you wind up with a surplus of $3 million, you would only make appropriations and change for the $1 million over extra.
Well, as I understand how it's going to operate, and I want to clarify this, but the way it operates is, at the end of the year, she's going to take the budget and allocate it this $2 million, and then the percentage, the 10%, and then whatever's left is then the working capital, and whatever's left of the sum of the 3, right?
Yes.
The 25% for the working capital is then going to be available for any use.
Okay.
Right.
We're in agreement.
That's the way it mechanically it's going to operate.
And that any use can be
whatever.
Capital, it could be recurrent expenses,
Whatever.
but none of the
Not recurrent.
No, not recurring.
recurring.
If we, we could, before you vote on the motion, so everyone's clear, if we could look at attachment A and just let me step through the sections of attachment A so that we can, I think we could clarify this fairly quickly, and then we can talk about the changes. Okay, so does everyone have the actual, it says attachment A, draft fund balance policy proposed for adoption.
Right.
Right.
Let's just step quickly through the sections.
Purpose is simple. It just talks about why we want to have one. 2, the sources, again, simple. Sometimes we end up with budget surpluses or unanticipated revenues. 3, it briefly describes the categories. 4, we actually describe in detail the categories and the target levels. And this is the first thing that I'd like to talk about. We've made the emergency disaster reserve a flat $2 million.
Right.
I've suggested that what's left be divided into 2 pieces: budget stabilization at 10% of the most recent adopted budget, working capital at 25%. The suggestion I've heard was that we take that 10% and we make that a flat number as well. So that would be my first question for you as a group. Do you think it's clearer or simpler to make that budget stabilization number a flat amount as opposed to a percentage?
I differ with that. I think it all stay as a percentage, because if everything works right, hopefully, in years ahead, we're going to pay off some debt, and the cash flow is going to be different, and we need a little more flexibility than that.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I would stay with the
I have
percentage.
no problem with the percentage. I was using the dollar amount to try as my example.
Just to help clarify.
Yeah.
So
Percentage is
everyone
fine.
Pretty good with the percentage? Again, you're not voting on the specific, but I want to know what you'd like to have me
Right.
change.
I had a question on point 2 before you go on.
Sure.
This reads like the general fund balances are accumulated through budget surpluses. That was not the intent for the emergency fund, was it?
No, that's how they happen. A fund balance wouldn't exist if you didn't occasionally have a budget surplus. So that's just an informational item. The only way that fund balances grow is if you have a budget surplus for some reason.
For the emergency fund as well?
No, this is not about any individual fund. This is a fund balance as a whole only is accumulated through budget surpluses. Before we break it into what we're keeping and what we're contemplating spending, that's really almost in the nature of a definition. We don't actually have any other way to come up with fund balance.
So you
except
can't
for
just put it
budget
as a line item in the budget, along with other expenditures. It has to be surplus.
Well, you do sometimes have a planned budget surplus as a cushion, which we probably would stop doing now that we have this policy.
Okay.
But yeah, the only way it ever happens is if your annual revenues come in bigger than expenses. That's the only way your fund balance ever grows. So that's really more of a definition, like
Okay.
3 and 1. Sort of
So
broad.
I was
it's like the
hoping-
whereas in a
I was hoping
resolution.
for a line item, and you're saying, no, we can't
Yeah,
do that.
no,
Okay.
it's kind of a whereas.
All right.
So now we go to 5. And this is where, Mr. Brevant, you're correct. Mechanically, what I'm proposing is that once we've decided that we have $2 million in emergencies, 10% in budget stabilization, and 25% in working capital, then every year after we issue the audited financial statements in March, we will know exactly what our total fund balance is. We can subtract from it the 25%, the 10%, and the $2 million, and anything above that is available to be spent by council in one of 3 ways. They can either amend the budget in that current year they're in April or May and spend it in the current year. They can save it and we can put it on the table as part of the budget adoption for next year. So when we come, we could say, well, here's a balanced budget, but on top of it, you've got $500,000 available to be spent on something else and still have a balanced budget. And on top of it, you can leave it. And this is what the city manager was talking about. You don't have to spend it right away. You can just leave it and let it accumulate until some future date when you have $1 million or $1.5 million and you want to do something else with it. That third is not as likely as the first 2, but it's in there as an option. I don't recall an instance where I've ever said, and here's $500,000 you could spend on something, and heard, well, let's just save it till later. But it's there.
Well, particularly if those who are paying taxes are saying, why are you accumulating this over what your policies are if you're accumulating it at millions of dollars? That's all.
But again, I think I want to keep being clear about the fact that we do not program to accumulate people's taxes. We program for balanced operating budgets where revenues, including taxes, and let's keep in mind that ad valorem taxes are about $4.5 million, $5 million out of a $20 million budget. So they're not even the primary revenue source. Okay. Are the vast percentage of the revenue source.
And we program that to the best of our ability. We predict it. Same with our expenditures. And at the end of the year, whatever happened, happened. And sometimes we win, and sometimes we lose. And when we win, fund balances go up. And when we lose, fund balances go down. It's really not something that we program to have happen or that we over-collect taxes. Taxes are programmed at a level that supports the operating budget. But anyway, back to this. So now we've made a little calculation in March. We've said, hey, we've got our 25%, we've got our 10%, we've got our $2 million, and it turns out we ended up last year with $11 million. You have an extra 1.5 or 2. Then we put that on the table. Would you like to spend it now, spend it during budget, or save it for a rainy day? We've already got our rainy day money, so do you want to save it for a project down the road? If it is appropriated, item 6 addresses what can we spend it on. First, it's 5, how much? 6, what? And this is where we say, basically, you can't spend it on recurring items. It has to be spent on non-recurring items. Again, as the mayor or someone who was at the podium pointed out, that was a big part of last year's discussion, and so this part of the policy really helps clarify this is our intent. We'll spend it on non-recurring expenditures, and we'll spend it in support of the general government and not transfer it to enterprise or utility funds. 7 is if we have an emergency, the city manager can authorize use of the emergency or disaster reserve. That's if we had a hurricane and the city manager says, hey, we need to get out there and start clearing the roads before we get to a council meeting. And then 8 is where we talk about how to replenish those 3 layers and in what time frame if we use them. So I guess 8's really the crux of it. You had made the comment at the last meeting, Glenn, that you thought we should add some verbiage to clarify that the emergency disaster reserve replenishment is the number 1 priority. And then I guess this is where we need to add some verbiage, and I'll take suggestions as to how to clarify that budget stabilization is for when something happens that you didn't expect, not so that you can just do another mid-year budget amendment and spend another $2 million.
Right, it can't be a planned expenditure.
Right. So any suggestions as to how, we could word that to make it clear but am I correct? That's where you'd like to see that?
Sure,
Yeah.
sure.
It's pretty clear, Cindy. This is nice work.
So I guess it's really thank you.
So then it's up to the council to decide whether this is an emergency situation or not. That's what we're saying here now.
Well, on the emergency disaster reserve, we were pretty specific that it's for funding for tropical storms, hurricanes, damage to infrastructure. We are no longer self-insured. We have big deductibles on some of our insurance policies.
Small
so if
point,
a building burns down,
only half serious. I would start that as when the emergency disaster reserve is used, rather than if. But
okay,
I'm only half serious there. Either way is okay.
Is that a pessimist thing? When, not if.
When. Okay.
So maybe just beef up the language. Instead of saying the city's audited unassigned fund balance drops below 35 but remains above 25, instead to be something that, if as a result of some unforeseen budgetary need, something like that.
And maybe I'm overreacting to it, because it does specifically talk about minimum reserve and replenishment of fund balances targets. If emergency, and then it just goes the first paragraph. All I'm saying is it could be implied that only affects the first $2 million, not the next 10%. You see what I'm saying? It's not clear that definition of emergency disaster reserve.
Well, that's the reason I use the this is more of an ordinance format.
Yeah.
The reason it says bold capital emergency disaster reserve is that's a defined term back in this other section. So I made sure, and this I'll work with Wayne and Peggy on this. I made sure to use the defined term for that to make it clear that this is the chunk.
That's all I'm concerned about, and make sure that the second paragraph is included in the definition of emergency disaster. That's all.
Well, the second paragraph would be the budget stabilization part.
I understand.
Got you. So how about something and I'll work on it some more, but how about something like if, as a result of some unforeseen budgetary need during the year,
Correct.
the city's fund balance drops below. In other words, talk a bit more in that sentence about what would cause you to use the budget stabilization, and
That's-
not just, hey, we thought of something else. Okay. I'll see what I can come up with.
I still have trouble with having the working capital reserve tied to budget surplus, because if the budget surplus is not there, you need a working capital reserve anyway.
It's not tied to budget surplus. It's tied to the size of the budget. So it's 25%
size of the budget. It's not
total
linked
budget.
to the surplus. Okay.
Yeah.
Fine.
Because, if the budget's $20 million, I want 25% of that. If our budget
Sure.
for some reason goes up to 25 or drops to 15. So
Okay.
it's actually tied not to the size of the fund balance, but to the size of the
So
budget.
that is more like what I was saying as a line item. That has to be in there. Okay.
Yeah, it's defined as being the target level of working capital is 25% of annual budgeted operating expenditures in the most recently adopted budget. So it's 25% of the most recently adopted budget's operating expenditures and transfers. That's back in section 4. All right, well, I will, I know we have other things we need to talk about, so if anyone has any other comments, I'll take a crack at this again based on those comments.
You okay, Mr. Chairman?
Absolutely.
Sure.
And then you'll circulate that before the next meeting. We can come back and then have a final approval of. But it is our intention. Let's go back to your.
Maybe I disrupted
what your amended motion is that we can vote upon to certainly show our intent, because we don't have a final version.
The motion was to adopt the policy as an ordinance with some of the language clarified, and then that you have an alternative of policy of the ordinance. You would second it pending the written language, which it's basically just that she will bring it back with the changes that as discussed.
You okay with that?
Any discussion? If that's the case, you want to call a roll?
Mr. Stump?
No.
Mr. Smith?
Yes.
Mrs. Barton?
Yes.
Mr. Brevant?
Yes.
Mr. Gorey?
Yes.
Passes 4-1.
Switching gears and moving on to
Another one of your priorities.
customer service. This was actually on the last agenda.
Yes, it was. We kicked us around twice.
Hang on a second. So let's talk a little bit about what we've done so far, and what we're hoping to do in the future here with regard to customer service and technologies and some of our offerings. And this is something that, again, the Utility Commission looked at, and we'll talk more about their agreement or recommendation later. Back in October of last year, Council requested an update on the progress and the timeline for improvements to our customer service technology and our process improvements that we've been talking about for a couple of years here in this commission. And so let's talk about it. First of all, there was some question mark about being able to pay utility bills online. We have that capability right now, and I think some of our customers may not realize that. It's through a third-party provider, but you can go onto the city's website, and you can actually pay on your credit card or your debit card right now. You can do that online. You can call them on the phone and do that. And there's also a pretty good portion of the city's webpage that shows other methods, automatic methods for paying your bill, most notably automatic monthly debits. And in conjunction with those automatic monthly debits, you can do what's called budget billing, where we'll look at the last 12 months average bill and give you an amount that's the same every month. And certainly that's something a lot of our customers take advantage of, is the auto debit, along with the fact that they know exactly how much it's going to be every month, is very convenient for some people. In addition to that, you can also pay in person at the city's customer service lobby. You can walk in or drive through anytime from 8:30 to 5, Monday through Friday, and you can also pay by mail. So there's certainly a wide variety of options right now for our customers to pay, kind of geared toward whatever your desire to use technology is, from stamp and throw it in the mail to show up and visit us to pay online through credit card.
In the use of technology, which of those methods creates no extra expense? Because I imagine like the third party charges a commission.
The third party does charge it, but not to us. They charge it to the customer.
Yeah. Which one would not incur expense for the customer? Any of those tech methods?
EFT. Because I don't believe we'll charge you for that. We don't charge you for that. Even showing up to visit us means you've got to pay for the gas, and putting in the mail means you've got to pay for the stamp. So really the one that's no extra expense at all that I can think of would be automatically monthly EFTs. Unless your bank has a service charge for that. So. Which it's hard to say. Perhaps Bank of America does. So one of the things, I guess, that helps to put all this in context as we talk about the rest of this is I've included as attachment C some data as to the kind of the monthly volume of everything. So if you want to pull that off and put it out to the side, I think that really helps as we talk about things like e-box, lockbox, your question about the different methods and what's the cheapest. Right now, we process average monthly volume that hasn't changed much since I put this in front of you last year, of about 34 to 35,000 transactions. Of that, almost 18,000 come through the mail in either what we call scannable mail, where it's comes with a coupon and everything's good and together, and we're able to actually scan the payment coupons. Hand key mail, these are checks that come in either without the payment coupon, or in the case, as we'll talk about, of bank-to-bank checks. They come without a payment coupon and have to actually be researched and hand keyed into our system. We have about 4,300 people a month that use our walk-in or our lobby cashiers, another 3,000 that use our drive-through, another 1,700 that use our night drop, and then about a little over 6,000 that use EFT, and then about 1,000 to 1,300 customers a month that actually pay through that third-party credit card billing provider. So as you can see, the way we are right now, we are very, very heavily utilized in all the ways that cost staff time and a lot of direct interface with the city. And so our goal, and we looked at this same data not too long ago, was to try to put technology offerings in place to hopefully slowly change the demographic of our customers to be a little less face-to-face and a little less labor-intensive for us, and a little easier for people to do things online and rather than in person. You know, having said that, every time we've talked about this, we've also talked about the fact that we can put every great technology offering in place, but as long as we continue to have lobby hours and drive-through hours from 8:30 in the morning till 5 o'clock in the evening, we cannot really have any real staff cost savings, because if I have a window open, I have to have a person in it, regardless of whether one person comes up every 10 minutes or 10 people come up in 1 minute. You can't have an open cashier window or an open drive-through window without a person to man that window. It's sort of the bank's problem.
Cindy, how many employees account for that walk-in lobby, 4,300 transactions? Do you know?
Right now, we have 3 full-time cashiers and 3 part-time. And then as far as customer service goes, we have a number of customer service representatives, but they don't actually take the money. They don't deal with the money part. So right now, we have 3 full-time and 3 part-time cashiers.
And are there any extra employees for the drive-through, or are they?
No, that's
combination.
Drive-through, and if you look at the drive-throughs on one side of the cashier cage, and the windows are on the other. So let's talk about the process improvements we've accomplished and what we're proposing to do going forward, and talk about how that'll affect our staffing and our offerings to the customers. Phase 1, updating our utility billing software. That has actually been completed. We went live with our new billing software back in September of last year. We, as you recall, had software that was 10 years and 10 versions out of date, and we successfully accomplished that with minimal disruption. As a matter of fact, I think I told everyone if it happened and you didn't know it happened, then and we did a really good job, and I bet none of you knew that it happened. So therefore, it was a success. We had one day, I think we were closed, and we published that for people like probably 2 weeks or 3 weeks in advance. We closed one day for the go live, and we actually put everyone's cutoff notices in abeyance till Monday and that sort of thing. So that went very smoothly. The next thing that we're looking at doing now that we have that stable platform of software are 2 banking services, eBox and Lockbox. Let's talk for a minute about eBox. Right now, when you go on your bank's website to do a cash or check bill pay to the city for an electric utility bill, you might have it in your mind that you type in the information and then electrons come to us. Well, the way it works right now is your bank produces a paper check. And that paper check is mailed to us, and that's mailed to us without any coupon. And that falls into my hand key mail. About 95% of that hand key mail is generated by eBox and requires someone to actually sit down, look at your name, maybe your address, figure out what your account is, and hand key it in. And so eBox is really a no-brainer. That will create a true bank-to-bank capture of that data, and that's one where we believe that just based on eBox implementation, we could eliminate 1 part-time cashier. So there will be some staff savings there because that really lightens up the back of the house workload, if you will. The next thing is lockbox services, and this is where the bank gives us, we create a virtual PO box. And what happens then is when you mail your bill in, it goes to the bank. The bank has a commercial processing center where they take care of depositing it. We have a software interface with them where we can clear exceptions or problems that come up. But by and large, we would not actually touch any of the mailed payments. And if you look, again, at the transaction types and the volumes here, Lockbox would take care of 11,000 pieces of mail that come to us and the remainder of those hand key mail. So about 52% of the city's transaction processing would be taken care of by doing eBox and doing Lockbox. Unfortunately, again, unless we're willing to change the hours substantially in our customer service lobby, which I've never gotten the impression from anyone we really want to do right now, and that's fine, there is no more staff savings associated with the Lockbox part of this. However, we have had a lot of turnover in the cashiering function. You know, it's particularly in part-timers. And so the nice thing about Lockbox is while we may not be able to reduce the number of staff beyond the part-timer reduction for eBox, the bank's back of the house processing center doesn't go on vacation, you know, there's no turnover there. There's a lot more continuity and efficiency in using the bank to do this than there is in using staff to do this, so that we're not, you know, if we're short a person, or at one point we were short 2 people, you know, it doesn't affect our ability to process those transactions. If you look there at the bottom, of that second page, you got a little chart there, and essentially the net annual costs if we implement both are about $39,400. And remember, the cost of that is shared amongst both the electric utility, the water and sewer utility, and the solid waste division. So I'm going to go ahead and say, and this is what I recommend to the Utility Commission, even at a net positive of about $40,000, I think this is something that's well worth doing. And certainly sets the stage for the next phase of these upgrades that I'd like to talk about. So. Can I answer any questions about that? Or?
On that basis, we're eliminating about this 18,000. Is that what it is, Cindy? It's 11,001 and a 6,900. Mm-hmm. So it's about 18,000.
About 18,000. About 52% of our total volume would be handled by that.
Mm-hmm. So on that
and
basis,
essentially, no more pieces of mail would come to us.
So on that basis, it's really costing us 25 cents a door, roughly, a month.
Mm-hmm. That's probably about right.
Implement the system.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And again, giving us back efficiency and continuity. And also, you know, it's not just the cashiers. Customer service pitches in when the mail volume gets high. This has an impact on the mail delivery attendant that works for purchasing. IT also assists with the processing and preparation of mailed payments when volumes are high at certain times of the month. So there are other departments that would reap a benefit from this that would enable their short staffs to go off and do other things. IT, for instance, would have more time to do other things than to just sit and try to process payments.
Well, in my mind, you're eliminating some really redundant work. It's not the smartest work in the world we need. So
It definitely takes away from.
yeah, I mean it's.
Yeah.
And it positions for any decisions in the future if, in fact, you do want to cut back on some of the face-to-face. But shouldn't there be some savings in IT if, in fact, you modernize the platforms as opposed to having continually to pay to have them change? You said 10 times in 10 years? Or?
Oh, no. We didn't change it for 10 years. Our software, our billing software platform is a third-party provider, so our IT department doesn't code that or what's the word I'm looking for, do that. I mean, it's a purchased software program. But what had happened was it's the same as if you purchased Windows like 10 years ago and you never updated it. There was all kinds of built-in functionality and plus just a lot of stuff that was outdated about our billing software that we just hadn't upgraded. We just refused to upgrade for 10 years and 10 versions, for a variety of reasons. So now all we've done is we've created, the software is now up to date, but it doesn't change IT's workload at all. IT has daily processes they go through, batches. Again, everyone thinks hard about the electric utility and the water and sewer utility, but what you don't realize is that our IT department also handles all of the general ledger accounting, all of the check prints, all of the payroll, all of the computers that are on city desks, all of the servers, firmware updates. So no, it doesn't change the IT workload at all.
I thought I was trying to refer to contracted IT services to do the upgrades, but evidently.
Oh, there were actually some changes, I think, in our annual contract costs, but with Kayenta for this, but it was more to the point of they'd gotten to the point where they were just going to refuse to stop supporting it for any price. So our annual contract with them is probably pretty close to the same. The implementation costs were good, but the annual fee to them is pretty close to the same.
I didn't want to digress. It just appeared to me that if you have massive changes in your updating your software, you should have some downstream collateral, but never mind.
I will tell you where it helped is it used to be, and I think many of you remember this, anytime we wanted any kind of a report out of the system, we had to actually pay them to design a custom report because there really wasn't a lot of reporting functionality in the software. Now, there's so much that it will do just that's built in, portals and data extraction that we don't, every time we say, hey, we'd like a report that gives us this, we don't have to go pay them $5,000 to create a custom report so that we can do what we need to do. So that helps as well.
Well, particularly if you have the Finance Commission making outrageous demands on you. Or, heaven forbid, the City Council, which I'm sure they never would ask.
Well,
they don't lower the price. You just increase the quality that you get.
Yeah. No, there were times where people wanted things that they ended up not getting because they didn't want to pay, $5,000 or $10,000. So yeah. So anyway, that's kind of where eBox and Lockbox shine, and that's what we at least for right now. That's the first thing that we would look to do. Now, there's a time frame here that says September 30th, 2016. This was because we were talking about this back in October, November of last year. Obviously, that's not still true if it's February and it hasn't progressed any further. But it is still about 6 to 8 month time frame for implementation, or 6. I have 4 to 6 for implementation once we get rolling. The next phase, which is, and again, eBox and Lockbox are kind of like the software update. It's really not going to matter to customers. You're not going to see the effect of that. But again, I think it sets the stage for the third phase, which is the one that everyone's the most interested in, which is how do we then create a website where people can come and do their business with a cup of coffee on Saturday morning in their pajamas and not have to actually come and have face-to-face interaction with our customer service representatives and our cashiers. And could we do that to enable people to, pay their bills, set up recurring auto payments, start and stop their service, all the things that some of the bigger utilities have available through their website? The answer is 2 things. Yes, as Jim is fond of saying, it's just a function of money. I would have to tell you that kind of a website will be very, very expensive, and it's certainly something we'd have to tackle as part of the budget process for next year or the year after. I don't want to toss out numbers, but I wouldn't be surprised if a website of that size and caliber from the ground up is well over $300,000 or $400,000. And then if we do that, and we start incentivizing our customers to use that instead of coming to see us, then maybe in a few years we can start to think about dialing back those lobby hours and those window hours. But I'm proposing that we don't do that until we actually create that capability and drive the customer demographic that way. You know, it costs a little to have that kind of a lobby and have that kind of responsive customer service, but I think people have come to expect that of us, and it kind of distinguishes us a little bit from, maybe utilities where you can barely get a person on the phone, and you're certainly never going to get to sit down face to face with someone if you have a problem that needs to be addressed. And so I think that if we'd like to move in that direction, we can. I think this commission in particular has kind of always said, let's not be abrupt about that and just shut the doors and start telling everyone, call on the phone or go look on the website. So
I would agree with that, but Vero Beach, because somewhat of the average age of the community will be a little behind in adapting to that electronic only. But I think we should move that way, but recognize that it'll be slow here.
Just in that light, Cindy, on our demographics, what's the average electric bill out there? Is it $100 or what is it? I mean, when I'm looking at this demographic, I'm sort of different with John and saying, look, if they were on Florida Power and Light, they'd pay the bill electronically and be done with it, but.
Well, again, at 1,000 kilowatt hours, the average bill right now is $119.
About $119.
Yeah. So, you have some that are smaller, some that are bigger. Again, keeping in mind that most of our customers, or a good majority of our customers, have electric and water, sewer, and their solid waste.
Right.
And so, the average total bill is more than that.
Yeah.
You're maybe looking at, I don't know, depends on your water usage and depends on whether you're with us solid waste or not. But we have I think that's a pretty substantial quantity of people. Look, it's over 20% that either walk in or drive through every month to pay their bill.
Well, it does
That's
feel
a huge
like
amount
a smaller,
face-to-face.
a more friendly city, and there's no doubt about it. There's no doubt about it.
Yeah, we're pretty centrally located, and we're an easy trip for people. And I mean, that's a lot of people. 8,000 people coming to that.
But on the other hand, we're in a business, so we're nickel and dime budgets too. We're trying to save the nickels because it's damn hard to save the dollars.
But if you look at the total cost of customer service, which I think a lot of people don't realize, when you look at the customer service budget, you need to remember two things. One, that's the customer service representatives, and it's also all of the meter readers and the entire meter shop function, which wouldn't go away no matter what you do here. Right now, we're doing the whole meter read thing for something definitely under $1. I think more in the neighborhood of about 80 cents per bill per month, and we've been told by our utility consultants that that's a very good price. So you have to take that part of it out and then leave it down to just the customer service, and then those costs get shared with water and sewer and the electric utilities. So it's really not in the context of a $92 or $93 million a year budget.
No, it isn't.
It's really not that much, know. But it's a question. It's a policy decision. How much is it worth for the kind of personable, face-to-face interaction that people are used to?
Any discussion, or I want to make a motion to approve?
It's really e-box and lockbox.
So
right now.
moved.
The only thing I'm asking for right now is your recommendation regarding implementing e-box and lockbox to the net cost to the city of about $49,000 a year. That next piece, that Phase 3 website, all that stuff, that's a whole other conversation. The Utility Commission voted 4-0 to move forward with e-box and lockbox.
Has any thought been given to incentivizing our least costly form of making the transaction?
Yes, I have given that some thought. What I'd like to see us do, and I've seen other utilities do it, is offer people who sign up for EFT when they open an account, no deposit. Not commercial, but residential. And that way, if we're EFTing and something bounces, we would reinstate the deposit, and it would be 2 years or 3 years or a time frame where we wouldn't give it back. But to give people the opportunity to do electronic transfer when they first sign up without having to put a deposit down, I'd like to see something like that. Mm-hmm. Yeah, because that's an easy form for us.
Or even those that already made a deposit, they'll get their deposit back if they switch.
And those who make a deposit and pay on a timely basis do, after a couple of years, tend to get it back.
Anyway.
But yeah.
Cindy, in looking at the website, I thought it was fairly easy to operate. The only thing I did wonder about it, the public has gotten a little worrisome about giving anybody their check number and all that business. I mean, maybe we ought to do a better job of selling the confidentiality, that we are protecting their database. I mean, every time you pick up the newspaper or Wall Street or something, somebody's lost millions of people's personal data, bank accounts. Mm-hmm. I did notice you have the security, the little lockbox. A lot of people don't know what that means at all. You know what I'm saying? And I noticed you also had the S behind your website, so that should imply security. I'm not sure a lot of elderly people know what the heck that means at all.
And that's actually not the city's website. I mean, that when you click on that, you exit us and you end up with CSI.
But I'm not sure the public understands the confidentiality of it. And I looked it up to a small firm in Florida, but I think that may be one of the problems. We can't get them to convert over.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'd love to see everyone on EFT and budget billing. That would make me very happy. But
incentivize it. 2%.
Well, we can't incentivize it and lose money, but the one thing I could think of is we could certainly give up deposits.
What's it cost you to do a hand transaction?
Well, then you get into the whole. I don't know that legally we can even charge people less for a utility bill just for doing something like that. Like I said, the one approach we can look into it, but the one approach I've seen is just not requiring people to put a deposit down because they've already given you a sure way of getting their money every month. And again, people are reluctant to do that, but if you combine that with budget billing, you know exactly what it's going to be every month, and it's very predictable expense, and it's very easy to do.
Someone want to make a motion?
So moved.
John, you're going to move for approval of the...
Yes, for proceeding with the lockbox.
I'll second the motion.
All in favor?
Aye.
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 We will move forward.
All right, we have the quarterly financial report and variance analysis.
So what you have in front of you is the first quarter of 15-16, and it being the first quarter, it's not that exciting. So I can do this quickly. Just what you have are the financial report, and you should have a hard copy that was brought to you, and the variance analysis. And as we've talked about before, the variance analysis is limited to those line items that have a budget to actual variance that's more than 10% over or under 25% year to date, the pro rata amount. And also the line item itself has to be bigger than $70,000, so we don't spend time in kind of in the minutia. And as a result, what you'll see are pretty much all variances that are within the normal parameters at this time because they're things that aren't pro rata. First line item, and we talked about this earlier, it's part of the reason the cash is up at the end of the first quarter. We have already through December 31st of 2015 received 80% of our ad valorem taxes that we are going to receive for the whole year. That's how people pay their taxes in November and December. On the flip side, we have some of our state revenue sources where we had to accrue back 2 months to the prior year, and those are lagging in the other direction. And really the only thing in here that I would say constitutes an actual real variance that might continue until the end of the year is the gasoline and oil being under the budgeted amounts. And we'll just have to see how that goes throughout the remainder of the year. But other than that, I didn't see anything in here that I thought was a quote-unquote a real variance that might persist until the end of the fiscal year that really needed to be discussed.
The only thing I saw was the interest on investments, but that's so volatile because rise like the stock market and the bond market.
Yeah, well, again, we're not in stocks in that. We're in T-bills and all kinds of short-term government instrumentalities. That's the only thing we're allowed to put our idle cash in. This is not the pension investments. And so we all know how that was the first quarter. So Some of that recovers toward the end of the year, but yes, it wasn't. It was good. We did pretty good last year compared to the budget, but first quarter this year hasn't been that great. And we recognize unrealized gains and losses as well as realized gains and losses every quarter as well. So.
Well, I'm sorry, I was generalizing that, not just for the general fund, but for all of our funds.
Yeah, it wasn't a good quarter for that.
The only one I had, Cindy, was page 19, non-departmental. We're 51.5 against on $1.2 million. What was that?
Sorry, in this report?
Yeah, I think it said. My notes say non-departmental was budgeted. It was running at 51.5 now for the first quarter. Was that a double payment or?
Let me see if I can find.
Just
non-departmental. You're looking for page 17.
Well, I was doing it from my computer, and the pages never match up. I can't.
That's okay. One of the things that's in non-departmental is the debt service payments.
What's
non-departmental includes the debt service payments, and our annual debt service payment for the one
bond deal,
is $885,000, and that comes out in the first quarter of the year. So of that $1.2 million, almost $900,000 is a debt service payment.
is the bond payment. All right. And
again, if you look at that's where it's accumulated. But if you look at page 21,
okay,
you'll see.
Oh yeah, there's a 690.
Yeah.
Right. And that's our golf course, right?
It's one of our debt service payments, yeah.
And on page, again, I'm lost a little bit because I'm going from computer. My page is 31, overtime salaries. I guess it must be your page 29, I guess, Cindy.
Yes, most likely.
Yeah, so I noticed we were 49% there on overtime salaries in the first quarter. What, I don't know. Maybe shutting the plant down, or
the electric utility. The salaries are kind of up and down all over the place. If you look, the maintenance salaries are on the flip side down around 14%, and the overtime is around 16%.
Yeah, everybody else is under budget, and then wham, we got overtime.
Yeah, on the whole, I think they're doing fine. But yeah, there's been just kind of some ups and downs.
So it looked like maybe we're shifting over some overtime people because we didn't have the proper staff, or I don't know.
I don't actually have the answer to that. So rather than make it up,
I'm just asking a question. I don't know.
I don't know the answer off the top of my head, so I'll go have a look.
In the electric, I think a lot of that is we lost a lot of manpower at the power plant, but we still needed people there for the decommissioning and stuff.
So we had
and
to
I know
fill
there
in
was
with
some
our
shifting, and had to put people there.
Okay, that's sort of what I thought. Okay,
I think that's T&D overtime though, so I'll go check into it.
Those are my only two items, Mr. Chairman.
A small item on my pages 5 and 7, just for clarification. You have the electric sinking fund on page 5 with actual expenditures but no budget, and
The sinking funds are actually just the place where we accumulate the money that's due for the next debt service payment at 1/12 of the upcoming payment.
So it's not a budget item.
So it's not a budget item.
Okay.
Yeah, they're technically a fund, and you'll see the electric and the water and sewer sinking fund both. The actual debt service payments are budgeted in the 421 and 401, but that's just where we put aside the upcoming debt payment.
Okay.
Yeah, that's truly a sinking fund. Same with the 202.
Right, and there's some in the 400s.
Yeah, that's the governmental debt. Yeah.
Any other comments? I'd just like to make a comment. I opened up, and as Cindy was pointing out, stormwater, that essentially there is stormwater which was anticipated to be covered financially by a utility, not a new organization, but just folding it into Public Works and having a stormwater utility fee based on some parameters that in fact would fund the capital for all of the stormwater work. The report is out, and I don't know whether the commission had an opportunity to see this preliminary report.
Just came out today.
It just came out, and so the point being is it's rather elaborate, and I didn't want to get into the details except that to state that the whole stormwater utility is merely a funding mechanism as opposed to a bureaucratic overlay. But the fact that with absenting a stormwater utility, how are the stormwater projects we need going to be funded? And that is one of the chicken or the egg issues that are, and I'm sure this will come up downstream, no pun intended, in terms of our discussions of not only this, but our revisiting of the OPEB, which I know we will be.
Mr. Chairman, I think you're going to have a joint meeting with the Utility Commission, and our consultants will be there to review the stormwater utility report with you all.
And that meeting is scheduled for?
22nd.
22nd. Yep.
Whatever day. Okay.
22nd.
I just had one more comment about when we moved away from the variance analysis into the court reports on everyone else's page 32 and Mr. Bravant's page 30. I did that math in my head, and it's been a long afternoon, and I was still able to subtract
We're going to have
two.
a customized Bravant report.
Run that computer, okay.
If you look at the electric utility consolidated sheet, you'll see a couple of things. Our actual total cash balance on hand, as you might expect, at December 31st is down almost $3.4 million from where it was in September. That is because our main debt service payment gets paid on December the 1st. It's $6 million a year, and we pay it all in the first quarter. Our unrestricted cash there at the top, which, again, total cash balance is not the money you have to spend. The total cash balance includes people's deposits and sinking funds and things that are not yours to spend. But the unrestricted cash and investments there at the top of a little over $20 million, $20.8 million, is down about $400,000 or $500,000 from the end of last year. The reason that the days of unrestricted cash on hand are up to just about 100 or 101, which is a little up from our target of 90 days, is because the operating expenditures that you use to calculate them are down substantially. Last year's operating expenditures minus depreciation were over $79 million. This year's budgeted operating expenditures minus depreciation are 75.6. And so we've actually had a decrease in cash, both total and unrestricted, but we've had an increase in days of unrestricted cash on hand because our budgeted expenses have gone down. So we're still, I think, in good shape there. And then other than that, I don't have any other excitement about this particular report.
Our city council gets great credit for this 101 days because they approved the budget, the OUC. Good work, guys, right?
And again, this is the kind of thing a few years ago when some other things were happening, we had our unrestricted cash drop down to some levels that had our bond rating agencies very concerned. And we, got downgraded just a little bit. And as a result, in the last 3 years, we've had some good positive feedback from Fitch and Moody's both. And they're starting to be very comfortable again that we're doing what we said we were going to do a few years ago. We're running the electric utility like a going concern. And we're taking seriously the idea that we need adequate unrestricted cash on hand for operations and also to make sure that our bondholders, because we have bonds, that we've issued in this electric utility, that our bondholders are comfortable that this is a going concern with adequate reserves. So,
but if I was running those numbers the way we initially said, 90 days, right, we'd have about 11 days, and dividing into $20 million, that ends up being about $2 million in excess funds. You could argue. Working capital funds that somebody else could use for.
I want you to keep 90 days in perspective. According to the bond rating agencies like Fitch and Moody's, 90 days is a minimum.
That's our minimum.
They consider a healthy utility, at least in the case of a water sewer utility, the highest rated utilities have 360 days of unrestricted cash on hand.
That's an overst.
Well, but Moody's and Fitch are the ones that decide who's giving out the bond ratings, and I will tell you, 90 days to them is in the bottom tier. It's good, it's adequate, but it's not considered particularly impressive. And so
we got a low liability against our assets too, right? Mm-hmm. And so, coming back to the issue we're all facing up with, how do we get Big Blue beginning to resolve itself, right? One could make a case, logically a case here, that there's a couple $1 million here that could go to help begin to resolve the Big Blue problem.
Well, again, I would agree that we have good, solid reserves in the electric utility and cash on hand to help resolve issues that we have as we deal with operations. So, however you want to look at that, I wouldn't say like, oh, yeah, we got $2 million to spend, but we have adequate cash reserves.
We got a capital expenditure problem facing us, and we have for the first time in several years, a much more stable operating environment on an expenditure side.
Although keep in mind that we adopted a budget that includes transfers to the capital expenditure fund for plant-related capital that no longer is necessary. So we've got that at our disposal as well. I mean, we had adopted budget money set aside to spend money at the plant that we're not going to spend on ongoing plant refurbishment that's available to help deal with some of these things as well. So I'd say we're in good shape. In terms of the longer term goal for that corner and the kinds of money we're talking about when we talk about moving substations and things like that, that's a completely another ball of wax. But in order to close down the plant and do the things that we've called phase one or whatever we're calling it now, I think we're in comfortable shape.
But we still have a far more stable cash flow here. We don't have the swings in cash flow here we do on our own operating side. So this is a much more stable cash flow. Our working capital is much more stable. There's no doubt about it, right? So, I mean, there is some, and I'm not saying spend it, but we have a problem, and we have an opportunity to do something to clean up assets that are biting the city at the moment. So anyway, we don't need to talk about it.
Well, just as a fill-up on that, I'm sorry.
Go ahead.
Excuse me. Water sewer utility fund is $16.6 million, and the annual revenues are $15.9 million. Correct?
The water sewer fund is where Moody's considers A, AA, AAA plus. The water sewer fund has a very good fund. But now, again, you've got to look at the absolute dollar amount. If we are seriously talking about moving plants, $15 million, it's not that much money. So, but yes, the water sewer fund, again, I think I hope I gave this to maybe everyone. If not, I'll recirculate.
But I thought knowingly we all knew that, and we're accumulating funds for potential movement of water plant.
And there has been some conversation about that and/or using that money to actually pay off some of the smaller SRF loans. I've been talking with Rob Bolton about that, so that you actually free up recurring money for that. But I did this.
We got cheap money borrowed.
Right. I did this a little while back, and I don't know if I shared this with you, but this is a history of the cash balances in each fund going back to year-end 2009, which is not really all that long ago. In the end of 2009, the water and sewer utility had only a $1 million cash balance, and it was all restricted. It had zero unrestricted dollars. And in the case of the electric utility, it had an unrestricted cash balance of only $5 million. And so certainly, at that point in time, this is where but my point is, this is the point in time where the bond agencies got very, very unhappy.
Yeah.
And we had some downgrades in our bond rating, and where we had sort of, and I think this comes back to our conservative point of view, we had sort of spent fund balance without any thought about where it was coming from the following year, and put ourselves in what I consider a pretty precarious position in two of our major utilities. So I agree with you. I think we're in good shape right now, in a very stable shape. It's come to where it needs to be, and it's stayed pretty level for a couple of years.
You will make me happier when you begin to say we have beginning to resolve the other issue. Okay.
That's a policy decision.
Well, I guess my last point is that we've done rate sufficiencies
Yeah.
for electric. My question is, do we have rate sufficiencies for water sewer on the same basis? I'm sure we do. I just don't recall.
I've heard Jim say our water and sewer rates are not much different than the counties. Is that right, Jim?
That is very accurate. As a matter of fact,
So,
you know,
I mean,
we have a small percentage of our customers that are tied to the county rates.
yeah.
And that's Indian River Shores. Now, we have granted county rates to the folks in the unincorporated areas, but we've only done that just by the city council determining to do that.
Right.
And so we do have county rates. What we see are revenue. We had a revenue addition from the Indian River Shores when we imposed those rates.
I remember you saying that. Yeah.
I just had a quick question. And
Sorry, Mr.
you know, by the way, I mean, everybody should get that sheet. I hope everybody's got that. Kind of see where we've been and where we've gone. It's been kind of a rocky road, but I'm certainly glad we're kind of on a little more sure footing. Every once in a while, you say something that just pricks me, and I got to ask the question again. You made a comment on unrestricted cash and assets of the electric fund, and you said it was going down?
It's actually down from the end of September. By the unrestricted cash is down about $400,000 from where it was. If you just look at the two balance sheets at
Right.
September 30th and December 31st, and the overall cash is down $3.4 million, restricted and unrestricted, because we made our debt service payment in here in the first on the
But in
first
the
of December.
unrestricted here, I mean, was there any anomalies there that caused that?
It's about $400,000 out of $21.8
Because I'm
million.
just watching the bills and I'm seeing that the bills are coming in significantly less.
Mm-hmm.
Therefore, I would cognitively think that the reserve or the cash would come up.
But we also cut rates twice, once in September and once again at the 1st of December. You know, we did a rate decrease predicated on the reductions in the OEC costs. So we've had two rate decreases.
My apologies. Now I'm seeing this quarter ending 12/31, so the January, February hasn't gotten in there yet.
But the 400,000 is small enough in the context of the whole thing to be just a seasonal variation too.
Okay.
Yeah.
Any more discussion? What's interesting, the commission is required to have 4 meetings a year according to the charter, and last year we had 12. Just as an aside. If I can go on the update to the electric utility, I'd asked Jim if he could comment on what the various, whether it's the legal or whether the our billing, what our status is on our electrical utility.
Do we talk about the electric utility a little bit?
Talk about the electric utility. We are still in our phase 1 of the power plant, taking the personnel out of there. We've reduced our personnel by almost half, and we will be reducing even further within the next couple of months the hours that we need at the plant. We are in the process of getting our bids to remove the oil out of the tanks, and that removal of the oil is also cleaning of the lines. And then from there, we'll put out another RFP to sell the tanks and to remove the lines there, as well as the cooling towers. So what we're trying to do is get the building down to the size that will be there, that will give people, I think, a better perspective of what the site actually is. There is a storage building on the north side of the plant, and we're hoping to have that removed as well. At the same time, we take down the oil tanks and free up that area. There's some question as to what kind of equipment we may need to keep on site there and to retain for the substation and replacement parts. But since the building's already there, if we can use it. But otherwise, I'm trying to push toward having that totally removed, because I think the community really needs to see what this site really looks like with as much of the stuff off of it as we can actually take. When we take down the tanks, we're going to level off the detention ponds that are underneath it and sort of give a sort of a green space look to that. We, as you know, we had an outage that affected us last week. That was a major outage. Was caused by this part blowing up right at the substation number 7. Number 7's up where Home Depot is. And what happened is that when it blew apart, this portion here fell down on what we refer to as C phase. As you know, going into a substation there, it's a 3-phase system. When it takes one of the phases out, the transformer that receives the current automatically did what it was supposed to do, and that is to shift off, because if you have unbalance in the phases, it can blow up your transformer. So it acted appropriately when it did that. We did have some issues at the water plant, which we're working on now, and hopefully get that. And so that issue will not be involved in any future outages that we may have. This part and this area was just inspected about 3 to 4 weeks prior to this occurring. We are doing some heat ratings around our poles and our connections in all of our substations, and trying to figure out the future if there's some heat buildup in the resistors. And so this infrared cameras will allow us to do that and sort of give us a much better reading than what we're doing right now, sort of eyeballing it. So we are putting systems in place to even address it as we go forward. But as I've told everyone, if you think of our electric system, it's sort of like your house. If you have a breaker that goes bad, we have breakers at substations. We have breakers on poles. We do a lot of work to try to alleviate some of that. For example, in 1 month, as I recall, I think there were 39 outages, and 11 of those were caused by animals. People joke about squirrels. We cooked quite a few squirrels around, but we have now squirrel protectors that we're putting out in the system itself. They're a little on the expensive side, but we are in the process of retrofitting a lot of our lines, especially in those areas where we have major issues. Our tree trimming has not changed, and that is by the demand of the residents that we have. As you know, that we value trees here. We are a tree city, been for 40-something years, and people don't mind you coming in and trimming out the trees after the outage has occurred. Then they realize it's an issue. The problem is getting in there before an outage. But again, we're looking at that, and we're trying to make sure that our contractors know, take as much off a tree as you can when you get in there, and then may take a little guff. So, but that's another leading cause of our outages that we have. By and large, we are faring very well with the utilities in the state of Florida, the time of outages, the number of outages per customer served. So I think that statistically we're still doing good, but any outage is a bad outage. So we're working to make sure that reliability becomes a very, very important part of our system. We were making maintenance and doing maintenance when we were going through the major selling period, and we thought we were going to really transition into FP&L within that 1 or 2 year period. And we did overlook some stuff, especially things like investing in, and as much as it's sort of a joke, but in the squirrel guards and some of those things, we didn't really make those new investments. We are now starting to bring that up. We realize we still have a contract with FP&L, and that transaction could take place. But as Cindy said, our consultants understand now we do have a going concern, and we're moving in that direction to make sure that it is operated in a going concern, and we respond and have our equipment as updated and as current as possible. So I feel very good about the electric utility. I don't feel good about our rates. Unfortunately, we are just now seeing some of the benefits. As the mayor indicated, our bills are looking much better with our new OUC contract, and hopefully we will be able to pass on some more rate decreases as we go forward. But we're still working through some of that. We do still have some major expenses, for example, in the litigation area. With the county, we're obviously still in litigation there and going to the Supreme Court and, of course, Indian River Shores. And we're, sort of working through those processes. I will tell you, and from a perspective, it would really be good to have a third party, a court or whoever, determine what playing field we're on. And we've chosen to go the route of courts. And so if that's the determined way to do it, then the courts are eventually going to come down and say, this is your right and this is your right. And we work from there to try to resolve whatever issues. But again, I feel pretty good about where we are today, and hopefully our rates will start to continue to come down. Cindy says we've had 2 rate decreases in the last few months, and hopefully you'll see some more in 2016. Answer any questions you may have.
Yeah.
Yes.
Jim, in regard to the proposed purchase by FP&L of the Shores accounts, it's supposed to be...
Dan, let's clarify that. The FP&L's has made one offer, and it was not a negotiable offer.
Okay, but there was supposed to be a meeting set up in Tallahassee with some of the consultants to explain whatever we negotiated with or whatever the basis for our saying that our account is worth more than the figure that was given out by them. Has that meeting been set?
It's already taken place, and the discussions around some of the numbers. Now, FP&L was not at that meeting. That would include the consultants from Indian River Shores and Chef and our rate consultant. And they asked some questions, and Chef and Bill are now going through and documenting where they got the basis for some of those issues. For example, our return on investments or something that they asked about, we showed them the documents. Cindy had a documentation as to how the city set it at, 4.16 or something.
Whatever the discount rate was we used for that. I think it was 3 and some change.
And so we're giving them the documentation that backs up what we have.
Do you know, excuse me, do you know when any of that's going to be made public, any of these figures and statements?
It shouldn't be very long because they're still putting together the information. Now, we did get a report from our attorney, from Chef Wright, as to, what took place in there. Sherry, if you can see if we can get it. I know the council all got a copy of that. That was the report from Chef. That was the white paper. We can send it out. It obviously did not have any final determination because, as I say, they're still carrying on their conversations, and we're providing them information.
It's really just interrogatories we're working with.
Well, in this particular case, when the 2 consultants worked, it wasn't interrogatories. It was our $64 million and their $30 million at P&L. So actually what it is obviously there are several different elements in our $64 million, as there are different elements in the $13 million, and they've asked specific questions about each one of those elements that we are trying to document. Now, the court case itself, the interrogatories, we are going through a considerable amount of that. A lot of paperwork. Most of it is on CDs now than paperwork, but a considerable amount of that is being passed back and forth.
I just want to point out that for all of the utilities, now that's water and sewer, for all the city departments is well over $2 million. So a portion of that, and of course that's enterprise as well as the $650,000 in utilities that's in the city, but that also will have a favorable impact to the degree that the rates can be further reduced.
That is correct.
Legal fees?
No, actual costs per year for the utilities. $644,000, Glenn, for utilities in the general fund, and $1.5 million alone for utilities, about mostly electric motors in the water sewer. So 10% savings or 10% savings, no?
Yeah.
So.
But again, the electric utility feel very good about. I think that we've now sort of stabilized and using it as a going concern.
Okay.
Any other questions?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, fine.
annual report. We are required once a year to report on our activities for the former year, and I had asked that a copy be sent to all of the Finance Commission members. Sherry?
Yeah, they have a copy of it. Is your microphone on?
Where is it?
It was your last item on your agenda. Mr. Corey, is your microphone on?
What?
Is your microphone on?
Yeah.
Okay.
Where's your report, she's saying?
The annual report was sent along with the agenda.
I didn't see it. Let's see. That doesn't need it. Oh, I didn't get that. I didn't get that one.
I don't know whether other members of the commission had.
Have you seen this, Dan?
I'll give it back.
That should have been included with your agenda.
All right.
That's just your
Can
annual
we-
report.
Can we hold
How
that?
do you
or-
get that?
or not?
Well, no, if people haven't reviewed it.
We need to approve it.
Do we need to put a more timeline? Okay.
Well,
Okay. Has John got a copy of this?
No, I don't have one.
If you just want to let them know what it is and ask them if they'll approve it. I don't know why it wasn't included with their agenda.
well, why don't we make copies and give it to everyone and take a 10-minute break?
Yeah, it won't take us long to review it.
I mean, it's just bullet points on 2 pages. and
Right.
I don't have any problem with reviewing it.
What I had done was to go through all of our agenda items, all of our minutes for the last year, and wrote down the high points of that, to do a retrospective of last year, and then addressed some objectives and goals for the following year, one of which is OPEB, for example.
Yeah.
And some of the other, continuing some of the other monitoring. But I just don't want to rush it through. Can we just make some copies? And
Yeah, if you want to take a break, I can go make some copies.
You want to take a 10-minute break, Mr. Chairman?
Yes, can we take a 10-minute break? It's been going nonstop, and I know that someone might want to come up for air for a little while. I don't think this is really the final item that I had intended to bring up, unless some other members. But we are required, and everyone else in the city has, in fact, commission and boards have made the report. We had not, because we were awaiting a meeting so that we had our new members and that we had the information from Cindy that we could have a meaningful meeting rather than just have a singular meeting a couple of weeks ago just to have the report. So if you could do that.
I've not seen it.
Pardon?
Many have not seen the report.
Well, that,
If you want to take a break, I can go make copies of this right now.
Yeah, I can take 2 minutes and look through it.
well, that's what we're going to do. Sherry's going to go and
Everybody else has seen
make
it.
a copy so everyone has a copy of it. And
We'll do it.
if
You got it,
do
Mr.
that.
Chairman, we'll read it.
Okay. We're adjourned
You're
for
on.
10 minutes.
Thank you.
If you don't have any more for me, I'm going up to the office